Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy, but we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. The first item of business is time for reflection, and our time for reflection leader today is Martha Inés Romero, Secretary General of Pax Christi International.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and the members of the Scottish Parliament for the opportunity to lead time for reflection today. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Martha Inés Romero, a Colombian peace practitioner, serving to the Pax Christi International movement as Secretary General. Pax Christi is a global peace movement working worldwide since 1945. Today, 80 years later, we continue promoting peace by active nonviolence and education, by promoting human rights, restorative justice, ecological sustainability, and reconciliation. The peace sought by Pax Christi stems from a recognition of the innate dignity of all the planet and of every human person, and the autonomous rights of peoples. Pax Christi International has promoted a spirituality rooted in an absolute belief in the dignity and worth of every human and observance of social justice. With a network of over 100 grassroots organizations globally, Pax Christi addresses the root causes and consequences of violent conflicts, scaling community local voices from the peripheries in global conversations at the decision-making tables for context-specific solutions. Pax Christi has a fundamental message. Only through nonviolence we can build a more peaceful world. In many places around the world, the humanitarian crisis is severe, and people are suffering the causes of the increasing budgets for war and the many interests on natural resources through extractivism, mining, agrobusinesses, and others, not for the common good, but for their corporate interests. We accompany those communities in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia Pacific to defend their right to live their culture in their lands. Pax Christi International is promoting a global ethic of nonviolence through its Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, and is also a steadfast advocate for nuclear disarmament. From the Working Group on Disarmament and Integral Human Security, we campaign for the elimination of nuclear weapons and the promotion of a nuclear-free world, supporting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, raising awareness about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear warfare, and collaborating with other peace organizations. We belong to the Nobel Peace Prize ICANN, to lobby governments at the United States for concrete steps towards integral disarmament, nuclear and small weapons. Those issues could be discussed in more detail at the parliamentary reception this evening in the event co-sponsored by Pax Christi Scotland, SCIAF, Justice for Columbia Scotland, and the Catholic Bishops' Justice and Peace Commission. All of you are especially invited. Thank you very much for your attention. Tapalif.
Thank you. Thank you. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 16684 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on changes to the business programme. Any member who wishes to speak to the motion should press their request to speak button, and I call on the Minister to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 16684 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is topical questions, and I call on Miles Briggs.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what its response is to the report, in their own words, Children's Experiences in Temporary Accommodation, which was commissioned by Shelter Scotland to show the impact that a stay in temporary accommodation can have on a children's safety, health and education.
Minister Paul McLennan.
No child should have to stay in accommodation that negatively affects their health. And I know that it's been hard for families to share these experiences. The number of children in temporary accommodation is still too high, but our actions are making progress. Our latest statistics show 20 councils have reduced the number of children in temporary accommodation in 23-24. We've targeted £42 million of funding at local authorities with the most sustained pressures. This has supported local authorities to bring 1,000 homes back into use through acquisitions and reducing the number of empty social homes.
Miles Briggs.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Yesterday, listening to these voices of these children, it is quite clear that many young people are being placed in totally unacceptable, poor quality temporary accommodation, and we need to see the Scottish Government do more to address that. The research demonstrates the detrimental impact that poor quality accommodation is having on children's health and their safety, and all members who were there yesterday heard that. So can I ask the Minister, why has the Scottish Government not provided standards of accommodation for the temporary accommodation sector, and is this something they will take forward in the housing bill?
Minister.
I think there's a number of decisive actions we are taking forward. I mentioned obviously around about the acquisition funding, and I know Mr Briggs has mentioned before around about Edinburgh, and we've taken action with Edinburgh in reducing voids. There's been a 55% reduction in voids. I also mentioned around about some of the areas that are facing sustainable pressure. We've seen a 25% reduction in West Lothian, 20% reduction in South Lanarkshire, and a 23% reduction in Fife. So we are taking action in working with local authorities. We're increasing the Affordable Housing Supply Programme budget to £768 million. Also, in terms of the actual quality of some of the temporary accommodation, local authorities are expected to work towards meeting the standards outlined in the Scottish Government's Temporary Accommodation Standards Framework, and that's discussions we continue to have when we're targeting acquisitions and targeting void.
Miles Briggs.
And I think the Minister would draw the conclusion, like the rest of us from yesterday, that that is not happening, that children reporting antisocial behaviour in the residencies they're staying in, rats in cots being reported, is totally unacceptable, Minister. And the emergency response, which the Scottish Government said they would bring to this, clearly has not happened. 10,360 children in temporary accommodation, a 150% increase in the last 10 years. But can I ask the Minister, in terms of education, there is a very specific ask within the report in relation to children being relocated and therefore having to change schools. Can I ask the Minister, when he says he works cross-portfolio with other colleagues, why have the Government not outlined a policy specifically around a presumption against children being moved from school?
Minister.
I think there's a number of actions we've taken that. I'd mentioned previously about the Ministerial Oversight Group, where I meet ministerial colleagues to discuss that, and there's actions being taken forward in that. For example, around about flipping. I've had obviously constituents mention the same issue around about that as well. I think one of the other actions we're doing is trying to focus on looking at houses for kids, for families who have larger families, a larger number of children, and we're focusing on that as well. And I think that's through the voids and acquisitions discussions that we were having in that regard. I'll come back to the point I mentioned around about the temporary accommodation accommodation standards that we're continuing to press local authorities to make sure that they match these.
Thank you. Emma Roddick.
In addition to the service costs and rents that we know total a very high cost of being homeless, one parent in the report spoke of spending £600 on transport every month to get their children to school or appointments. Others detailed the cost of inadequate cooking facilities and the burden of repeatedly purchasing essential items like fridges. Some older children also spoke of potentially losing their education maintenance allowance because they were at higher risk of missing school. In light of this, can I ask how the Scottish Government will help to ensure that those living in temporary accommodation do not carry an additional financial penalty, particularly for children and families?
Minister.
I think there's a number of issues that the member brings up in terms of that. I think obviously when we're talking about temporary accommodation and housing, we've got to look at the overall support that's there from the Scottish Government. The Scottish Child Payment is the only payment in Scotland, apart from the others in the UK. I think also one of the key points that we've had in discussions with that and discussions we had yesterday was talking about local housing allowance in terms of that as well. And we know that local housing rents only cover the bottom 30% of rents in a given area as an absolute minimum. So the UK Government's decision to freeze rates from 1st of April 2025 has put more pressure on families into moving to the rented sector. The Resolution Foundation estimates that permanently repegging rates to 30% percentile would lift 75,000 children out of poverty by the end of the UK Parliament. So I wrote to the Secretary for State for Work and Pensions in January, urging her to reverse the decision to freeze rates.
Thank you. Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's absolutely appalling that thousands of kids are living in the conditions that we've heard from this report every single day, and that's despite government promises to reduce numbers. That every 6 months we see statistics showing that the number of kids in temporary accommodation grows and grows and grows. Can I ask the Minister if he can give a guarantee that, given the report's findings and the absolutely awful conditions that children are living in, when the next set of statistics are released, we'll see a reduction in the number of children living in temporary accommodation?
Minister.
Can I thank the member for his question? I think we're starting to see some of the investment we've had through, for example, around about voids and acquisitions. I mentioned around about the reduction in voids we've had in Fife, in West Lothian, in South Lanarkshire and Edinburgh. We also heard obviously around about the 12 local authorities that have reduced homelessness and 20 that have reduced homelessness through children. We're also investing £768 million in this financial year in a budget which has just passed, which will enable the equivalent delivery around about 8,000 homes. We're also focusing on the £2 million that's been made available in the budget as well, focusing on empty homes. We've far too many empty homes, and we're continuing to work with the Empty Homes Partnership in terms of trying to turn around as many homes as we possibly can.
Thank you. Willie Rennie.
I'm not sure the Minister's read this report. I mean, the devastating impact is really clear. There was one mother who's referring to her 13-year-old son who's living in temporary accommodation. He is more sensitive and sad. This is devastating. It has lifelong impacts. And I don't think the Minister answered one single question that Miles Briggs posed. So can I put to him two of the issues that were put forward? One, about moving children between schools. Will the Minister impose a ban on that so they can't be moved? Secondly, will there be the standards framework, will it be reviewed so that we don't end up with mouldy homes with vermin in those properties?
Minister.
I think there are a number of points, I questioned the points that Mr Briggs has made. I was at the launch of the report yesterday, and if I've read the report, I think I'd referred in a previous answer to obviously to flipping, where there are properties that can be temporary accommodation that are then turned around to permanent accommodation. We've obviously worked very closely with local authorities in terms of the housing that can be available to families, and sometimes that can include, as I said, families who have 3, 4, maybe 5 children. So again, it's trying to find the suitable accommodation that's near the school at the particular time. And I think I mentioned also around about the Ministerial Oversight Group in working with colleagues around about that. Homelessness, I think, obviously mentioned around about some of the issues there, and the report itself mentions about the impact on health and the impact, for example, on a child's mental health, for example. So we are working as closely as we possibly can in regards to flipping, but also in terms of working with local authorities to find a suitable accommodation near the child's school.
Elena Whittam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too attended the launch of this hard-hitting report, and I thank Shelter for commissioning research that finally gives voice to what those of us in the front line supporting families in temporary accommodation have understood for years. Children experience multiple negative impacts to their well-being through any period in temporary accommodation, but this is worsened by long periods in poor and unsuitable placements, as well as by multiple moves. We urgently need more social homes, but can I ask the Minister how he and his ministerial colleagues can use this critical report as a lightning rod to galvanise action across the sector to improve experiences now? Children need wraparound personalised support, safe spaces to play, well-lit, fully furnished, safe accommodation near to their school and support network. And this should be the rule and not the exception. And everyone delivering temporary accommodation should be supported to view it through a children's rights-based lens.
Minister.
Yeah, I was obviously aware that Lena Button was at the event yesterday also, and I think it's kind of been touched on by a couple of members. Obviously, housing, homelessness has its own issues, but the points around about health was raised yesterday in the discussions we had, and I think that's an important point. The mental health issue was talked around about that as well, and we've got to make sure there's not a long-standing impact on that. So I think coming back to the point around about the temporary accommodation, we do expect there to be high quality in terms of being there to meet the temporary accommodation standards. So we're talking about how do we tackle the voids issue, how do we bring empty homes back in as quickly as possible as well. And I also mentioned around about the £768 million investment, which will bring houses forward at a quicker pace. Our Ending Homelessness Together plan is underpinned by a person-centred approach, and we expect local authorities to work to meet the needs of each household for temporary and settled accommodation. For children and young people, it means reducing moves between properties, living in a home close to their school so that they can maintain social connections and have access to outdoor areas and gardens. Obviously, we consider the recommendations that came forward in the plan yesterday.
Thank you. That concludes topical questions. The next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on international solidarity to support Ukraine. The First Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on the First Minister.
Presiding Officer, just last Monday, all of Scotland's political leaders took part in a powerful and moving ceremony at Edinburgh Castle to mark 3 years since the start of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. We stood together with members of the Ukrainian community living here in Scotland to commemorate the time that has passed since the start of that invasion, but also to reaffirm our support for the people of Ukraine. Though we disagree on points of policy and politics in this chamber, which is right and proper in a parliamentary democracy, when it comes to upholding the values and principles of modern democracy, the Scottish Parliament stands behind Ukraine, resolute and unwavering. Regardless of our political views, everyone in this chamber understands that democracy is hard fought for and must never be taken for granted. Democracy must be cherished, defended and enhanced. This is the lesson of the 20th century. This is the lesson the people of Ukraine live and struggle and fight to teach us every day. The courage demonstrated by President Zelensky and by all Ukrainians since the first day of Russia's illegal full-scale invasion reaches far beyond the protection and the preservation of their own homeland. Ukrainians struggle and fight for all of Europe and for the protection and the preservation of all democratic nations. It is a struggle for the rule of law, for human rights, and to uphold the international norms which once ensured Europe knew guaranteed peace. The Ukrainian people are fighting for their homeland, for their future, but also for our future too. 3 years ago, Russia expected to flatten Ukrainian resistance within days. But despite a war that has caused years of unnecessary misery in a peaceful, sovereign and democratic nation, the power of the fight for democracy and all its freedoms has given the Ukrainian people their purpose as well as their most potent advantage. Ukrainian people are fighting to defend her independence, her territorial integrity and her security in the face of appalling, unprovoked violence. Violence which has destroyed lives, separated families, wounded hundreds of thousands of citizens and razed cities to the ground. And yet, President Zelensky has not wavered in strength or dignity. His people have not laid down arms. Russia has not succeeded in reaching its war aims, despite sending hundreds of thousands of troops to their deaths or to be wounded on the front lines. But now, as a result of all this unnecessary carnage, millions of Ukrainian children have never known peace, while Western democracy has never been under such relentless attack from within. Misinformation, propaganda, malicious interpretations of history, arrogance, ignorance, prejudice and hate are being used to divide us. Only yesterday, after Russia launched a drone attack on a civilian building in Kharkiv, the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, "We see the collective West has started to become less collective. A fragmentation of the collective West has begun." That is precisely what Russia wants its people and the world to believe. That is precisely what Putin wants us to believe. We must be ever vigilant to the threat of disinformation, which takes the shape of the Kremlin's talking points. Russia was not provoked to invade Ukraine in 2014 or in 2022. No credence should be given to deflection tactics blaming NATO for expansion for Russian aggression. Each and every country in NATO is a democracy that has made its own sovereign choice to become a member, and many of the countries on NATO's eastern flank have recent experience of living under Russian threat. The strong international solidarity and dedication to achieving peace in Ukraine was evident for all to see at the Security Summit in London this weekend. And the vast majority of European leaders have only one message: their unreserved condemnation of illegal Russian aggression. Therefore, Ukraine's allies should all have one aim and one aim only: to support Ukraine's independence, her territorial integrity and her security. So I wholeheartedly welcome the Prime Minister's Coalition of the Willing initiative to provide Ukraine with security guarantees after a ceasefire agreement, as well as the £1.6 billion missile deal for Ukraine. I also accept the case for peacekeeping forces to avert further conflict, subject to proper scrutiny and a vote in the House of Commons. And I understand the delicate balance of diplomacy the Prime Minister and the United Kingdom Government must navigate in this matter. So I want to make clear my commitment and the commitment of my government to a united front, my commitment to do all that I can to support Ukraine to succeed. But I am sure, like the many European leaders who expressed their solidarity with President Zelensky this weekend, I am very disturbed by how his meeting with the US President and Vice President played out last week. I agree with President Zelensky's statement that Ukraine wants its partners to remember who the aggressor is in this war. And we must see unwavering unity across this political spectrum in full solidarity with Ukraine on this essential point. The events at the Oval Office meeting with President Zelensky and the announcement made this morning of a pause in US military aid to Ukraine can only run the risk of emboldening Russia, the aggressor. As I said this weekend, if this were to remain the posture of the US government, a second state visit for the US President Donald Trump becomes unthinkable. I know there are people in this chamber and across this country who will disagree, who will say that we should not contemplate this stance, or who will say that President Trump should not be invited under any circumstances. I understand and respect those points of view, but I cannot share them. Right now, today, as we stand here, men, women and children in Ukraine are putting their lives and their freedom on the line to defend their country and all of our democracies. We say we support them, and we do, but that means being willing to do things that are hard, things that we would rather not do. So if a state visit could help solidify US support for Ukraine, if that is part of what supporting Ukraine means in practice, then it is a possibility. For that to be true, however, the US would have to sustain the steadfast support of Ukraine, her independence and her territorial integrity. As we think through all these issues, the important questions are the hard-headed, clear-eyed consideration of what is best for Ukraine and European security today. For my government, that means standing steadfast behind Ukraine and alongside the United Kingdom Government and our European allies, and that is exactly what Scotland will do. My hope is that US and European leaders can once again find a way to speak with one voice on the matter of this conflict. There are no grey areas when one country chooses to send troops and tanks into the peaceful territory of another. My government supports the approach of the United Kingdom Government in committing to secure international solidarity in support of Ukraine's long-term future. We welcome the 100-year partnership recently agreed by the United Kingdom and Ukraine, and Scotland will play our part, whether as part of the United Kingdom or as an independent nation in the future, in helping to deliver it. I also welcome the approach of the Prime Minister and the proposed four-point plan to end the war and defend Ukraine from Russia. As I have already stated, Scotland accepts the case for the deployment of any peacekeeping forces to avert future conflict, subject to scrutiny and a vote by MPs in the House of Commons. And my government remains committed to supporting Ukraine until a just peace is secured, not a peace at any cost, which strips Ukraine of her sovereignty in wartime. So let me once again make clear, there can be no truly sincere or constructive peace talks about the future of Ukraine without Ukraine present at the negotiating table. And securing the future of Ukraine is utterly vital to securing the peace we have enjoyed in Europe for so long. Ukraine's future and her fate is our future and our fate. So we must aspire to be as courageous as the people of Ukraine and stand by them always in their hour of need. And we must maintain unity with our partners across Europe and the Western world, unity like that demonstrated in London this weekend and at Edinburgh Castle last week. Because events in Ukraine are having, and will continue to have, a direct negative impact on Scotland's economy, security and society. Presiding Officer, Scotland's approach internationally will continue to be led and guided by our compassion for Ukraine. I know this Chamber will continue to work together on these matters and to put any differences aside in respect of our common efforts to uphold justice. Now 25 years into the life of this modern Parliament, Scotland chooses to stand for democracy, for human rights and the rule of law at home and among our courageous allies like Ukraine. These are the underpinnings of democracy, of prosperity and of every freedom democracy provides. This is the solidarity among allies that will deliver Ukraine from Russia's barbaric aggression while protecting her heritage, her culture and her social and economic future. We have been honoured across Scotland that thousands of Ukrainians have made their home in our country. My message to people from Ukraine living here in Scotland is that you are and always will be very welcome here. Providing support and sanctuary for Ukrainian people displaced by Russia's brutal war continues to be a priority for the Scottish Government. I want Ukrainians everywhere to know that they also have Scotland's fullest support. I know many of them will be deeply concerned by what has unfolded over the last few days. It is for those brave Ukrainians and every person protected by democracy that Scotland will never be silent. Here in Scotland, we will forever stand with Ukraine.
Thank you. The First Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I intend to allow around 30 minutes for questions. It would be helpful if members who wish to put a question were to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on Russell Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We are honoured to be joined today by the Consul of Ukraine in Edinburgh in the public gallery. For more than a century, the United Kingdom and the United States have been the strongest of friends and allies, our bonds forged by shared values of freedom and democracy. During the First and Second World Wars, we fought alongside other allies to defeat fascism. In the Cold War, our unity and resolve prevented the very real threat of a Third World War and defeated the tyranny of the Soviet Union. Today, however, The old alliances that have endured throughout our lifetimes do not seem as certain. Last week's disturbing public disagreement between the Presidents of the United States and Ukraine feels seismic. For the sake of the heroic people of Ukraine suffering slaughter at Putin's hands, politicians in this country should recognise the responsibility we have. It is critical to do whatever we can to repair rather than exacerbate these rifts. Grandstanding comments, such as those from some senior SNP politicians, are self-indulgent and counterproductive. They risk sowing division between Western allies to the delight of the Kremlin and other despotic and dangerous regimes. Today, the First Minister rightly points out that Russia wants a fragmented West. We've seen their interference in Scottish politics and across Europe. So when John Swinney suggests that President Trump's state visit should be cancelled, how did he think that would help fragile Western unity? Today he says the visit should be conditional on, and I quote, "The US would have to sustain the steadfast support of Ukraine, her independence and territorial integrity." Does the First Minister really believe that he has the power to lay down conditions on the US, lacking any meaningful detail, and effectively expect the King to heed his terms? And finally, I'd like to ask John Swinney about his comment that our nuclear deterrent provides, and I quote, "no tangible or realistic benefit," and that nuclear weapons, again quoting, "are not stopping conflict in the world today." John Swinney is wrong. He is dangerously and naively wrong. Ukraine bitterly regrets forfeiting its own nuclear deterrent. During the Cold War, it would have been immense folly to surrender our nuclear deterrent. And with Ukraine, the United Kingdom, Europe and NATO no longer certain of what American future support might look like, this is even more true today. So does John Swinney recognise that in these serious times, the SNP's stance on nuclear weapons is not a serious policy?
First Minister.
President, first of all, may I associate myself with the welcome to the Consul-General of Ukraine, and I'm glad that he is here to hear these exchanges and the solidarity that we have for the people of Ukraine. There's actually a lot in what Russell Finlay has said with which I agree and empathise. I have lived through many certainties throughout my life, the certainties of the integral nature of the alliance between the around the Western world, and the foundations of solidarity between the United States and the United Kingdom. And I recognise the centrality of those relationships in creating the peace and stability that I have experienced all of my life, and I welcome that. I agree with Russell Finlay that those certainties have been weakened by recent days, and that, I think, poses significant questions with which we have got to wrestle. I think in that context, I have set out very measured remarks about the importance of ensuring that when we are trying to build those alliances, we all have to know where we stand. And the United Kingdom expressing the desire to extend a state visit welcome to President Trump seems to me to be the type of commitment that should be given to an ally on which we are working in consort with. And the uncertainties that Mr Finlay has talked about are uncertainties that we are all wrestling with now. So that's the rationale for me setting out the view that I've set out, which is my deeply held view, and it can be observed by whoever wishes to observe my view. But I think it's right in a democracy that we say what we think and what we feel. That's the essence of democracy, is it not? And lastly, on the question of nuclear weapons, I made no secret of the fact that my entire life I have not supported the possession of nuclear weapons. Indeed, the concerns about the possession of nuclear weapons was one of the reasons why I decided to pursue the particular politics that I have pursued all of my adult life, in a party that's been committed to nuclear disarmament all of its days. But I would simply observe to Russell Finlay today that with all the possession of nuclear weapons today, Ukraine has been invaded. And that is the reality of what we're facing. So nuclear weapons have not deterred Russia from invading Ukraine. And indeed, the challenges that are faced just now in Ukraine to ensure that Ukraine is able to sustain its military operations are conventional weaponry, which I think we should have more of at our disposal. So those are the arguments that I would put forward. But of course, we live in a democracy in which there has to be tolerance of other people's views, which may be different to the views of others. And that's why I am so determined to make sure that we stand with Ukraine, because by standing with Ukraine, we do all we can to protect the democratic values that have been central to our society today.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I join others in welcoming the Consul General of Ukraine to the Parliament? I was speaking to him just before we came into the Chamber, and he was emphasising how much it means to the great people of Ukraine to know that they have the resolute support of the people of Scotland and the people right across the United Kingdom. Presiding Officer, I welcome and thank the First Minister for his statement today. No one wanted to see the scenes that unfolded on Friday night at the White House. For 3 years, Ukraine, led by Volodymyr Zelensky, has defended itself against the odds. And the world has looked on in admiration and respect as the people of Ukraine have heroically stood up to brutal Russian aggression. Last week, I, like the First Minister and other party leaders, stood with the Ukrainian community in Scotland to mark the anniversary of the Russian invasion and to commemorate the lives lost. And the events of the last week are a defining moment for peace and security in Europe. It requires serious, grown-up leadership, not Twitter diplomacy. It's an issue of war and peace and of life and death. So politicians should not resort to childish attacks on social media for perceived party interest, but instead prioritise peace and the national interest. Keir Starmer is right to say that he will only take the actions that help achieve peace, not actions to undermine it. That's what should guide all of us. That's why he spent this weekend meeting President Zelensky and the leaders of 18 nations. And the Prime Minister is assembling a coalition to find a path that will end the war and ensure Ukraine's sovereignty is backed up by strong security guarantees. That means working together for long-term peace in Europe, and it means taking tough decisions like prioritising defence spending. Security is the first responsibility of every government, and all our actions should be guided by the need for peace. Scotland and all of the UK stands alongside Ukraine in its hour of need, and we should all recommit to the cause of peace and freedom across Europe, but the cause of peace and freedom across the world. So does the First Minister agree that if the result of this diplomacy and these actions is lasting peace in Europe, then it will be worth it?
First Minister.
In short, yes. And I welcome the role that the Prime Minister has taken in recent months, weeks and days, and particularly intensively in recent days, to try to establish a way through the very challenging situation that we now face. And I think the engagement with European leaders and with leaders of other countries, the Prime Minister of Canada, has been particularly effective in drawing together a body of opinion that can help to create some of the cohesion that is required to support Ukraine at this particular moment. So these discussions are fundamental to assembling the correct approach, and I have made it very clear publicly that we support the Prime Minister in his endeavours. There will, of course, be difficult issues that flow from the plans that the Prime Minister has set out, not least of which is the possibility of armed personnel from this country being deployed in Ukraine. Now, that is some way off, as we all know. But it is important that we contemplate those issues, that we discuss them properly and fully and openly as a society with democratic scrutiny so we can come to the right conclusions. Because where I fundamentally agree with Mr Sarwar is that the future of European democracy is very much in play at this moment. And what happens in the course of the next few days, weeks and months will shape so much of the future that lies ahead of us. And we have to make sure that we take actions that will protect the democratic values that we have all experienced during our lives and which are so precious in our society today.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by joining others in welcoming the Consul-General and by recognising the impact of these discussions both on Ukraine and on Ukrainians living in Scotland. The Scottish Greens stand fully in support of the political unity in defence of Ukraine's sovereignty, which the First Minister has spoken of, and which I had hoped all political parties would express here today instead of making party political points. I also want to recognise the dignity of President Zelensky and his courageous display of self-respect in the face of the astonishing mistreatment he was subjected to on Friday. He told the truth and challenged Russian propaganda. Scotland has strong solidarity with Ukraine and is outraged at those who would abandon them to an aggressor. But these events threaten all countries, including our own. Trump's choice to realign the US with Russia, and not only against Ukraine but against democratic Europe, is clear, and it's astonishing that some voices in the UK's politics and media are pretending that the world hasn't changed fundamentally. So I want to ask the First Minister about a matter within his own devolved responsibility. Following the US decision to cease cybersecurity operations against Russia, does the First Minister agree that he must ensure that the data and systems relating to all functions of the Scottish Government and Scottish Public Services must be secured? And will he urgently commission a review to identify whether any current or potential US partner company should now be considered a security risk?
First Minister.
President Officer, let me make 2 points in response to what Patrick Harvey has said. The first is the importance of truth, and Patrick Harvey used that term. And truth is so important in the conduct of these issues because we all know that Ukraine as a democratic society was invaded by an aggressor, Russia, and nothing should be expressed that does not make that point centrally in this discussion. And secondly, on the question of cybersecurity, the Government keeps all issues in relation to cybersecurity actively under review at all times. And indeed, the Cabinet was briefed this morning by the Justice Secretary, who has responsibility for civil contingencies and resilience within the Government, of the steps that have been taken to review our posture, because the issues that we are now facing as a society, as a country, are affected by the Ukrainian conflict and the events that are taking their course. And we have to be satisfied in the Scottish Government, and we in this respect will work closely with the United Kingdom Government in that respect. We must be certain that we are doing all that we can to protect the resilience and the resolve and the capacity and the capability of our country, and that includes our data systems into the bargain. So Cabinet will be briefed on these issues on a regular basis by the Justice Secretary, and taking forward the point that we agreed this morning of the importance of that exercise being carried out.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the appearance of the Ukrainian Consul-General, our friend Slava Ukraine, Heroam Slava. President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine are heroes. They deserve sovereignty, a fair and lasting peace, and the steadfast support of the entire world. What we witnessed in the Oval Office on Friday was appalling. In a premeditated act of thuggery, Vice President Vance and President Trump tried to humiliate one of the bravest leaders of our time on the international stage. It feels like America could be on the verge of a betrayal of Ukraine. But asking the King to withdraw the offer of a state visit would throw away the most significant leverage that we may have to influence Trump's thinking on Ukraine and America's place in the Western alliance. So I welcome the apparent movement of the First Minister on this in his statement today, as uncomfortable as that may be for many of us. So can I ask him, with the withdrawal of US aid overnight, does the First Minister agree with Liberal Democrat calls to seize the tens of billions of pounds worth of frozen Russian assets here in the UK and use them to support Ukraine's fight for survival?
First Minister.
First of all, President, so let me just say to Mr Cole Hamilton that what I've said on the issue of the state visit is what I've been saying all weekend. So there's nothing different about what I've said to Parliament today compared to what I said at the weekend. On the question of withdrawal of US aid and the implications in relation to the financial support for Ukraine from frozen Russian assets, there is obviously there's a very real issue which again was discussed at the Cabinet this morning between the use of the interest on frozen assets and the use of those frozen assets themselves. And that's obviously a subject of discussion amongst European partners. I think given the basis on which Russia has invaded Ukraine, I think those frozen assets, to me, are assets that should be contemplated being used in relation to supporting Ukraine in its time of need. Those issues have to be considered actively by European leaders, and I know that those questions are being actively debated, but he makes a point which is a reasonable point to consider in a time where the rule of law has been disregarded by Russia, and that merits a response which enables us to protect the rule of law and to protect democracy, and those issues should therefore be considered.
I call Rona Mackay to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been an absolute privilege to welcome Ukrainian people to Scotland during this difficult time. But in this time of increased uncertainty, particularly over the last few days, many will understandably be concerned about what the future holds for their country at home. What's the First Minister's message to Ukrainian people living in Scotland at this difficult time?
First Minister.
President Officer, Rona Mackay highlights the unease and anxiety that must be felt by Ukrainian citizens living in this country. Their lives have been turned upside down and they are now living far from their home and far from many of their loved ones. So I understand the anxiety that they will be felt. My message to those individuals will be to express the solidarity and the assurance of the support and assistance of Scotland to those individuals living in our community, and Scotland will be absolutely true to maintaining that support and that assistance to those individuals.
Well, Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The statement from the First Minister today rightly acknowledges the danger of division in our society. We all want a path for peace, but President Trump's recent decision has sent a bitter blow to the people of Ukraine. And in light of the withdrawal of US military aid, does the First Minister accept that at times of peril like this, that as part of the United Kingdom, Scotland can play a crucial role in efforts to support Ukraine with our world-leading defence sector based in Scotland? And will he now drop his party's call to scrap Trident in the interest of global security?
First Minister.
I think there's obviously, we have a number of companies in Scotland who are involved in the manufacture of military equipment. Some of that military equipment is manufactured for our own use here. A lot of it is also exported to other countries. Those companies make an important economic contribution to Scotland, and in a conflict environment, they play a pivotal role in ensuring that people in Ukraine can properly defend themselves from Russian aggression. So we, of course, welcome their participation in our economy, and they will be able to pursue their dialogue with the United Kingdom Government, who has responsibility for defence procurement. And as I said in my response to Russell Finlay, I have had a long-standing view that we should not possess nuclear weapons, and nothing in the current environment persuades me to change that view.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The US administration seems determined to appease the Kremlin's butcher of Bucha and seek a Carthaginian peace that makes the Treaty of Versailles look sensible. However, critical to peace is a guarantee of the security, territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine. First Minister, in terms of European solidarity, what can the Scottish Government and individuals do to show our continued support for a just peace for the people of Ukraine at this exceptionally difficult time?
First Minister.
I think the importance of a guarantee of security is absolutely fundamental in this discussion, because without a guarantee of security, then the suffering of the people of Ukraine in the course of the last 3 years will have been for nothing should they be exposed to further Russian aggression. So the point that Mr Gibson puts to me is vital. That's why I set out the Government's position here today, to contribute to the discussion that is underway across a range of European and Western countries about how collectively and collaboratively we can assure the security of Ukraine. Because if we do not secure the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, then I think we will be acting in a manner that will undermine the safety and the security of Western democracy, and we must not take that step. So therefore, the point I would make to Mr Gibson is the importance of us contributing to that European dialogue, to work with the United States to deliver the security that Ukraine requires, because if we don't do that, we will, I fear, see more of the aggression that we have seen from Russia in the future.
Neil Bibby, to be followed by Audrey Nicholl.
The Consul of Ukraine to Scotland, who is in the gallery, told this Parliament clearly just a few days ago that Ukraine needs free powers, weapons, economic sanctions and diplomacy. I welcome that over the last few days the Prime Minister has taken action on all three, pledged more weapons for Ukraine funded by sanctions on Russian assets and provided steadfast diplomatic support. Can I ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government will do to support the Prime Minister and the UK Government provide the things that Ukraine says it needs? And when he rightly talks about the need for a united front, does he agree that applies not only to our actions but our words, and that nothing will be said by members of his Government that undermine the efforts of the Prime Minister to support Ukraine and find a lasting peace?
First Minister.
Well, I don't think I could have been clearer about the support of the Scottish Government for the efforts of the Prime Minister, and that's expressed openly and genuinely to Parliament, and I wish the Prime Minister well in what he is trying to achieve. I don't underestimate the scale of the challenge that he faces, but I wish him well in that effort, and we will take whatever steps we can to support him in that dialogue, to ensure there is cohesion, there is resolution, to ensure that the security guarantees I talked about to Kenneth Gibson can be delivered for the people of Ukraine and their sovereignty can be protected.
Audrey Nicholl, to be followed by Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, the Consul of Ukraine in Scotland also told the Parliament's Constitution Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee that Ukraine requires, and I quote, not only peace but a just peace. Does the First Minister agree with this, and what would his message be on this matter?
First Minister.
The people of Ukraine have suffered enormously, and it is vital that the peace settlement that is achieved is a settlement that protects the independence and the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Those are the requirements of a just peace, and I think they should comprise the approach that is taken to confront Russia and to ensure that the aspirations, the legitimate aspirations of the people of Ukraine are fulfilled as a consequence of that support from the West.
Jackson Carlaw, to be followed by Keith Brown.
Presiding Officer, can I associate myself with the remarks of the First Minister and also acknowledge the work of the Prime Minister? It's important he knows he's acting on behalf of us all. President Zelensky, if not quite like Churchill standing alone, is certainly standing on the front line in this contest. It is the blood, toil, tears and sweat of the Ukrainian people that are defending democracy in the West. And I wonder, First Minister, if you would support a suggestion that an invitation from you and the presiding officer of this Parliament be extended, an open invitation to President Zelensky at a time of his choosing and convenience to address this Parliament. There is a precedent for this, we've done it before, but to invite him to address this Parliament and for that to be in conjunction with this Parliament convening a national day of solidarity with the people of Ukraine.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I would readily associate myself with the suggestion made by Jackson Carlow. Invitations to Parliament are of course a matter for the Presiding Officer and the parliamentary authorities, but for my part in the Government we would happily support such an endeavour. I think Mr Carlow raises an important opportunity for us as a country to come together to express our solidarity with the people of Ukraine, and I would be very happy to take part in any discussions on the important suggestion that he has made. And I think also, may I say how welcome it is that Mr Carlow makes clear his support from his political position to the work the Prime Minister is trying to undertake to try to resolve what is an extremely serious situation that we currently face.
Thank you. Keith Brown, to be followed by Jackie Dunbar.
Can I welcome the First Minister's strong support for the principle of Ukrainian territorial integrity, its independence, and for the principle of self-determination. The First Minister has acknowledged that personnel and other resources from Scotland may be deployed in any coalition of the willing in terms of democratic Europe's response to Russian aggression. Does he agree that the decades-long depletion of armed forces personnel and equipment in the UK Armed Forces requires rearmament, whether it's with the EU partners or non-EU partners, which should contribute to more effective recruitment, Armed Forces personnel driven by improved pay, greatly improved equipment and in relation to individual conventional weapons and cyber resources, and the provision of relevant training opportunities rather than squandering any resources on the immoral, utterly ineffective and increasingly irrelevant nuclear arsenal?
First Minister.
President, Mr Brown of course speaks with the authority of having been a member of the armed forces and who served in active combat in the Falklands War in 1982. So, as on many issues, I have the greatest of respect for the contribution that Keith Brown has made to public life and public service in our country in that respect, in the service in the armed forces, which I have never undertaken. He does acknowledge and knows the seriousness and the significance of deploying armed forces into roles of danger. The approach the Prime Minister is suggesting is to essentially be in a position to protect and assure the security of Ukraine, but that does not come without its dangers in relation to the behaviour of Russia, which we all know to be and to have been malevolent. So the issues that Mr Brown raises are very significant about the choices that have to be made about the deployment of armed personnel, and that is why I believe these issues should be considered and discussed openly in the House of Commons to enable a democratic decision to be made, and fundamentally for us to act in solidarity with the Ukrainian people in protecting their independence.
Jackie Dunbar, to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We must be steadfast in our support for Ukraine at this uncertain time, and I echo the need for international solidarity to defeat Russian aggression. Can the First Minister provide an update regarding the financial support that the Scottish Government has made available to support the humanitarian response to the conflict in Ukraine?
First Minister.
The Scottish Government has provided in excess of £5 million in relation to humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. That has been providing essential supplies in relation to health, water, sanitation and shelter. And of course there will have been additional support that's been provided for Ukrainian citizens coming to Scotland and making this country their home.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Our hearts go out to the people of Ukraine for what they have endured
and their hopes for peace and security for their nation and their right to sovereignty. Does the First Minister agree that we live in complicated and dangerous times with the rise of the right in Europe and the unpredictability of the US administration, and therefore we must strive for peace and stability in Europe and influence where we can all nations at war? And that includes peace and security in the Middle East, where Europe could play a leading role for peace.
Minister.
Polly McNeill will know that I come at my politics from the perspective of believing in the necessity of European cooperation and for active participation in European decision-making and in European governance. So I very much welcome the summit that took place, which was fundamentally of European leaders at the weekend that the Prime Minister hosted. I think that's an indication of really good intention on these questions. She's absolutely right that I'm certain there is more that at a European level could be undertaken to support peacemaking in the Middle East. We all watch with horror the events that are taking place, continuing to take place in Gaza as we speak. And the level of conflict in the world today is intolerable, and we have to use every available device at our disposal to make sure that we work to bring communities together and to avoid conflict in the way that we're experiencing conflict today.
Kevin Stewart, to be followed by Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We all want to see a just peace, and to achieve that, it is in Scotland's interest that we support Ukraine and its people's right to freedom, democracy and independence. History shows us that appeasing aggressors expands conflicts and prolongs wars. Does the First Minister share my view that no one who believes in democracy can afford to appease Putin and Russia's aggression?
First Minister.
I agree with that point, because I think the threat to our democracy and to the values that have underpinned our society is real if we are not able to address and defeat the aggression of Russia. That's the very real issue that we face as a society today. That is why this issue is so important and fundamental to the choices we face.
Stephen Kerr, to be followed by Emma Harper.
This is a wholly reserved matter, but the First Minister is right to express our united solidarity and support of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine, including those who now live among us in Scotland. But one of the lessons and measures that must now be taken by Britain is that we must, as Keith Brown said, rearm. And that will mean increases in defence expenditure, which are to be welcomed. The lesson of history is that securing the peace is best done through strength, and Scotland is critically important in that, because this is the location of many important defence contractors. So does the First Minister agree with what I have just said? And if he does, will he take this opportunity to disavow the hostility of so many SNP, MSPs and MPs towards the defence sector? In fact, there are ministers that won't even meet defence contractors. And will he take this opportunity to give his wholehearted support to these important businesses and their employees?
First Minister.
Stephen Kerr is correct that the issues of international relations are wholly reserved matters, but I would contend that these wholly reserved matters have an impact on our way of life. And if we don't confront these issues as a Parliament, I don't think we are addressing properly the challenges that face all of our communities as a consequence of the situations that we face. Now, there is a need for us to have effective defence forces available to us. Part of my argument is that I think we have a vast coastline and a vast airspace around Scotland, which is critical to the security of Western Europe, which is critical to the security of our country, which I think would be strengthened. Our ability to defend that would be strengthened by a greater emphasis on conventional weaponry than the investment that has been made in nuclear defences, and that's my reflection on the defence priorities that we should face. And in relation to the defence sector in Scotland, Scotland does have a very strong number of companies who are involved in defence-related activities. Those companies make a significant contribution to the economy of Scotland. I welcome the work that they undertake, and it's important that we recognise that and the difficulties that we face at the present time.
Emma Harper, to be followed by Paul Sweeney.
Nearly 48,000 Ukrainians have found refuge here in Scotland over the last 3 years, with about 800 being housed in Dumfries and Galloway. Their transition to life here has been hard, but it's been made easier by the huge work carried out by local agencies and volunteers, including my constituent Peter Cormillo, who has worked tirelessly to help Ukrainian refugees navigate our national quirks. Does the First Minister agree, as well as the official support from government, local and national, and support from Peter and many thousands like him across Scotland, that has to be valued, and it's been invaluable and a shining example of humanity across our borders?
First Minister.
So right around the country there will be various local groups. Indeed, I met a group from South Ayrshire just one day last week who'd come to Parliament, and they've been providing welcoming support to individuals. So Peter, that Emma Harper referred to, will have made that contribution. This group from South Ayrshire will have done so, and members from across the country, as I have seen in my own community in Highland Perthshire, in Aberfeldy, or in the work that's undertaken in Errol to support families and to dispatch assistance to Ukraine, have all made a huge contribution, which is deeply valued by the Scottish Government.
Sweeney, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister rightly recognised the contribution that Scottish industry has made to the defence of Ukraine, and to further bolster that effort, would he consider reconvening the Aerospace, Defence, Marine and Security Industry Leadership Group, which has been dormant for some years, and appoint a ministerial co-chair? First Minister.
I think that there's work that has been undertaken to reform the industry leadership groups that have taken place, and I think there is engagement with the defence sector, but I better check that point for Mr Sweeney, and I know there is ministerial interaction on all of these questions.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that a large number of Ukrainian families fleeing the war have been resettled in North Lanarkshire, with many being housed in refurbished tower blocks in Coatbridge in my constituency. As my constituents, my thoughts are very much with them at this unsettling time, and I have written out to them this week to remind them that they can contact me in my office at any time. Can the First Minister outline what ongoing supports there are in place to ensure that these families and the thousands like them across the country continue to be supported in our communities and feel the strength of our unwavering solidarity at this most difficult time?
First Minister.
So the support to Ukrainian families in Scotland will come from a combination of some of the community support that I know Mr McGregor's constituency will have offered, and which Emma Harper just raised with me in her question, but then also with some of the work undertaken by the Scottish Government and our partners. And that has always been important, but I think it's ever more important given the uncertainties that the people of Ukraine feel at this moment.
And John Mason.
Thank you. The First Minister indicates that he thinks we probably should be increasing defence spending, and I would certainly agree with that. But would he agree that also that money should not be coming from the international aid budget?
First Minister.
I think what I said at the weekend on this question is that I think we've got to have an honest and open discussion about the public expenditure priorities of the United Kingdom. I tried to have that during the general election campaign, where I was pointing out that our public services were under enormous fiscal pressure, and we had to improve the finances available for our public services. These issues that we are now confronting, affecting our defence and security, merit a response in that respect as well. So we have to have an honest discussion about our priorities. I don't view this as an either-or, that we can afford defence expenditure or we can afford public services. I equally take the view that John Mason is marshalling today, that reductions in overseas aid expenditure can be short-sighted, because we have got to change the nature of the inequality. We've got to address the inequalities in our world. Overseas aid is fundamental to doing that. That's been a shared priority of many governments over many years, and it's important that we address these priorities, but we can only do so with an honest discussion about the public finances and an honest discussion about the choices that are available in relation to taxation, and we need to have that.
Thank you. That concludes the First Minister's statement on international solidarity to support Ukraine, and there will be a brief pause before we move on to the next item of business.
Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 16657 in the name of Gillian Martin on Scotland's renewable future. I invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Gillian Martin to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, around 13 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be opening this debate on the rejection of new nuclear power plants in Scotland and Scottish Government's commitment to renewable energy. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to set out to Parliament the Scottish Government's continued opposition to new nuclear, while illustrating the exceptional opportunity that clean renewable energy presents for Scotland's economy and energy security. I will, at the outset, take the opportunity to reiterate the Scottish Government's position that we do not support the building of any new nuclear power stations in Scotland. Instead, our focus must be on accelerating the deployment of renewable technologies. Simply, renewables are safer, cheaper, faster to deploy and better for jobs than nuclear. Now, nuclear generation has gone on in Scotland for some time, but for the future we have better sustainable options due to advances in renewables technology. The people who have staffed nuclear fission stations in Scotland and continue to do so in Turness have played a vital role in keeping Scotland's lights on, and I thank them for that. The contribution of nuclear and electricity generation in Scotland is decreasing, however, and will continue to do so. The generation of electricity from nuclear fission presents a number of challenges. Not least, the nuclear generation creates a legacy of radioactive waste, which will have to be managed for thousands of years, requiring complex and robust management to ensure the protection of both people and the environment. Cleaning up Scotland's existing nuclear sites safely and securely is extremely expensive and will take many decades, as well as the creation...
Martin Whitfield.
To take an intervention. Is it also now the case that the SNP Scottish Government wouldn't consider any new fission technologies?
Cabinet Secretary.
Our position is clear that given the current technologies, this is our position. Now, we cannot say what will happen in the future. We cannot say what would happen with regard to the waste associated with nuclear power generation. It is that particular issue, as well as the cost of it, that is our opposition to it. But I want to make it clear to Martin Whitfield that we are looking at this from the position of the technologies as they exist just now, and I'll take Fergus Ewing.
Fergus Ewing.
I'm most grateful to the Minister for giving way. Whilst supporting our development of our renewable resources, does the Minister agree that to have a functioning electricity system, every country needs there to be a variety of sources of generation? And indeed, it was Sir Winston Churchill who said, when it comes to electricity supply, the solution is variety, and variety alone.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well,
Well, I can't disagree with any of that. In particular, I personally feel that hydro has been a very overlooked generator in the past. If you look at countries, neighbouring countries to us, particularly in Norway, who have placed a great deal of importance on hydro, they are very energy secure in a way that other countries aren't. So I would say that we have to look at, but that doesn't mean a wholesale acceptance of all the technologies out there. And I'm setting out the Scottish Government's vision in relation to new nuclear.
The Minister will the Cabinet Secretary give way?
Yes, I will, and then I'll
Kevin Stewart.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, I would like to see much more emphasis on hydrogen, as the Cabinet Secretary well knows, Scotland has a great boon when it comes to hydrogen production from renewables. Does the Cabinet Secretary see hydrogen as a major way forward as baseload?
Cabinet Secretary, give the time back for the intervention. I
think that hydrogen is going to have many uses, not least in the decarbonisation of transport and heavy goods vehicles in particular, and in industrial decarbonisation as well. Kevin Stewart is right to point to it, or potentially as even an energy source for domestic use as well. He'll be familiar with the 100 programme, the H100 programme in Fife, which the First Minister officially opened, which is actually trialling the use of hydrogen in a domestic setting as well. So I think that we've got the potential. This will be my last intervention, and then I'll continue.
Patrick Harvey.
I just wonder whether the Minister has seen the UK Climate Change Committee's report on carbon budgets just from, I think, last week or 10 days ago or so, which concluded very clearly that hydrogen, though it will have many other uses in the energy system, will have no role in domestic heating.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I have seen the report, but I have to say that I have heard from quite a few different sources on this matter, not least Scottish Gas Networks, who believe that a combination of hydrogen could be put into the gas grid to decarbonise the existing gas infrastructure as well. And I don't think we should be ruling anything out. We don't know what's going to happen in future with regard to technologies. But anyway, I'm going to continue with my speech, Presiding Officer, if that's okay. As well as the creation of a dangerous and long-lasting waste legacy of radioactive waste legacy, we cannot discuss nuclear power without reference to its capacity to cause catastrophic damage through accidents and malfunction. We have been lucky in Scotland that that has not happened, but it has got a tainted safety history with terrible incidents occurring at Chernobyl and more recently, of course, in Fukushima in Japan. Developing new clean energy systems for the future, we have a moral imperative to ensure the system does not have the ability to threaten the existence of any population or the environment we depend on. And as long as serious environmental concerns, the Scottish Government is wholly unconvinced by the economic argument for the development of new nuclear. The construction of new nuclear power stations is hugely expensive and would inevitably lead to a further increase in consumer energy bills. Take the case of Hinkley Point C. When given the green light by the UK Government, it was due to be completed by 2025 at a cost of £18 billion. And last month, ADF estimated that the project may not be completed until 2031 at a cost of up to £46 billion. More than 2.5 times the original cost estimate. And the news isn't better for electricity consumers either. Even the UK Government's own estimates show that the cost for new nuclear power is £109 per megawatt hour compared to £38 and £44 per megawatt hour for onshore wind and offshore wind respectively. So new nuclear generation will increase bills. As we transition to clean energy system, we must ensure that as well as being clean, energy should enhance economic growth, be secure and affordable. And that's why we've been clear that the UK Government's intended investment in nuclear. I'm afraid I've taken too many interventions as it is. Scotland already has an enviable track record in renewable generation, covering onshore and offshore wind, solar and tidal. And I echo what the First Minister said in his speech on climate action at the Botanic Gardens last month, that Scotland's greatest contribution to the global climate challenge is our renewable energy potential, our technical expertise and our capacity for innovation. Scotland proudly leads the way in onshore wind deployment across the UK. As of September 24, with approximately 10.2 gigawatts of operational onshore wind capacity in Scotland. And we're working hard to ensure that new developments maximise value for communities. With the onshore wind sector deal, the sector deal includes commitments for actions for government and industry that will secure benefits for Scotland's economy, communities and natural environment. And to complement our work on the deployment of onshore wind, we're also pressing forward with our ambitious offshore wind targets, which will ensure Scotland is fuel secure well into the future and provide good quality jobs and energy for the long term. While we have an estimated pipeline of over 40 gigawatts of Scottish offshore wind capacity on top of the 3 gigawatts already operational, these projects are crucial to support our commitment to a just transition and will continue to affirm Scotland's position as a world leader in the energy sector. With the deployment of renewable generation, while the deployment of renewable generation is important, their intermittent nature means that the development of storage capacity is essential for ensuring the security and flexibility of our energy system. Scotland has a significant pipeline of pumped storage hydro projects, equating to 6.9 gigawatt of storage capacity. And this offers a significant investment potential, bringing huge economic benefits from Scotland. And of course, I mentioned what other countries have done in this regard in my answer to Fergus Ewing. The energy transition is an era-defining economic opportunity for Scotland, with the potential to provide tens of thousands of good quality, sustainable green jobs right across the whole of the country. We are leading the UK in delivering a green jobs revolution and unlocking the tremendous potential that that transition and the wider net zero journey holds. The manufacturing supply chain and support activities associated with renewables is also set to give future to old industrial sites, like the HVDC cable manufacturing plant that is planned for Hunterston. Ardseer is thriving under new management, and of course the Sumitomo investment in NIG. And the £800 million coal-burn battery storage products in South Lanarkshire further highlights the scale of the opportunity to give disused industrial sites a new lease of life. We are striving towards a clean energy system and growing our national economy, and I feel very strongly that we must do this in a way that supports the communities that host infrastructure. And despite much of this being reserved to the UK Government, we are taking action to make sure that communities see tangible benefits from Scotland's clean power revolution. I'm afraid I've only got about a minute left, so I'm going to finish my points. In the last 12 months, more than £30 million worth of benefits have been offered to Scottish communities. However, the good practice principles that we have in relation to this must be improved, and the amount of monies coming towards communities must be ramped up. As I said, the powers to mandate community benefits and shared ownership are reserved. However, we're taking practical action to maximise these opportunities in Scotland, including our ongoing consultation on improving the good practice principles for onshore and offshore renewable energy developments to ensure that our national guidance is updated and fit for the future. And I would encourage communities, businesses and everyone with an interest in our energy system to take part and ensure that our guidance supports sustainable and meaningful outcomes. And we're also working hard to improve Scottish Government guidance on pre-application processes to ensure communities are heard by developers ahead of planning applications being submitted. And a review of that guidance will be published in the coming weeks. In bringing this to a close, and I am coming to a close, I want to reflect on the decision before us to spend huge sums of money on nuclear, which will not reduce consumer bills and will leave us with environmental hazard extending thousands of years into the future, or we can continue to invest in renewables and Scotland's future. There is a unique opportunity at stake. We have an opportunity to reach our climate goals, provide cost-competitive energy security and grow our economy through the deployment of renewables and associated infrastructure. To repeat, renewable energy is safer, cheaper and faster to deploy and creates more jobs than nuclear generation. Therefore, I ask Parliament today to reject the creation of new nuclear power plants in Scotland and the risks they bring, and to agree that Scotland's future is a renewables powerhouse that benefits the people of Scotland. And I move the motion in my name.
Thank you. Just a reminder to those members who haven't yet pressed their request to speak buttons but are intending to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons. And I call Douglas Lumsden to speak to and move Amendment 16657.3 at around 9 minutes. Mr Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've been in Parliament for 4 years now, and I feel this is the most important topic that I'm speaking on today.
Because up and down the country, people have real concerns on what they see happening to their communities, what they see happening to their homes. And many of them have contacted me over the weekend asking if I would speak up for them, because they are feeling ignored. And I have promised to speak for June, Andy, Vince, Shona, Caroline, Aileen, Kate, Laura, Angela and all the others who have contacted me, and all those concerned residents who I've met over the last 6 months from Turriff, New Deer, Lay Lodge, Angus, Save Our Mearns and everywhere in between. And we're in this chamber today talking about energy production and the importance of renewable energy, while the reality is happening in our communities and industries throughout the North East. If this devolved Scottish Government really cared about our energy production, the Cabinet Secretary would be meeting with the communities who I have met with. She would have spoken to the people who I have spoken to. She would have taken the time to go outside onto our own doorstep today and listen to the voices who are here outside of this Parliament telling the SNP to think again. I'll give way.
Minister.
Member for giving way, and not for the first time. I point out to the member the Ministerial Code, which does not allow ministers to meet with community groups engaged in live planning applications.
Douglas Lumsden.
Well, once again, they can meet with SSEM, but they can't meet with the people that they are meant to represent. And if you read the Ministerial Code, you'll see that that's wrong. Because, Presiding Officer, when I saw that there was to be another debate today on renewable energy, I, like many others, assumed that we would once again be talking about a just transition to renewables, the future of our oil and gas sector, maybe even word of the much-delayed energy strategy. So I was quite surprised when I saw the focus on nuclear. So this is this week's anti-science from this out-of-ideas SNP government. And what should be the most important discussion of our time, how we make sure we have the energy resources we need during international destabilisation, instead turns into a nonsense debate designed to score political points by this out-of-touch, out-of-ideas SNP government. We are living in a time of global uncertainty where most of our energy requirement still comes from oil and gas. And at a time when we should be looking at how we can become more energy self-sufficient in the short term and more green in the medium to long term. This government would rather stoke political grievance. We should be looking at how we can fulfil our energy needs by expanding our domestic oil and gas supply in the short term. We're over-reliant on imported oil and gas now, and the SNP want to increase that by shutting off the taps of the North Sea. Their presumption against new oil and gas is hurting the industry, hurting the North East and hurting the towns and communities that rely on the sector. And we also know that energy based on solar and wind is not reliable all year round. We need to ensure that we have a base load required when we need it. And that is why so many countries are considering small modular reactors. Scotland could be at the forefront of this technology, leading the way, but again this government insists on holding us back on false science and scaremongering. The devolved government should be harnessing the well-paid, highly skilled workers at Torness and Hunterston. Instead, they want to turn their backs on that with their scaremongering, pathetic motion they have brought today. If I have time, I'll come back to you. And they say in their motion that nuclear is more expensive. The CFD for Hinkley Point is £92 per megawatt hour, while the CFD for the Green Volt floating wind project that the SNP were so keen to fast-track was £139 per megawatt hour. No wonder Stephen Flynn received £30,000 for his campaign from one of the owners. The SNP are against new oil and gas, against nuclear, against speaking to communities and industries. Their only plan is to put all their eggs in one basket, have as much wind energy as possible, miles away from where the demand is, and cover our countryside with monster pylons, substations and batteries, and ignore the concerns of our residents. I have met with so many communities throughout the North East who are rightly concerned by the impact of Central Belt-led SNP policies. They are dealing with the realities of hundreds of kilometres of monster pylons throughout their communities and countryside. And I know colleagues in the borders have had similar meetings. No, I won't. They are concerned about prime agricultural land being taken away, covered in concrete for substations or bases for monster pylons. They are concerned about operating farm machinery under power lines. They are concerned about noise impact. They are health concerns. They have concerns about impact on animals. They are concerned about value of their properties. They are worried about rural depopulation, worried about biodiversity, worried about the chair of the SSE being part of the Ministerial Code panel. They are concerned at the number of battery storage systems in the planning system, worried about the risks and angry that no one seems to be listening to their concern. Maybe you should listen to this. They want to know why undergrounding and offshoring seems to be discounted by both governments. They want to know why the Scottish Government are content with blocking new nuclear using planning powers, but won't use the same planning powers to stop the desecration of our countryside. I'll give way to Rachel Hamilton.
Rachel Hamilton.
You can give way to some of your own.
Earlier today, it was announced that a wind farm application of 52 turbines in the Scottish Borders will go to the public inquiry before Scottish ministers decide its fate. Does Douglas Lumsden share my concern that communities are not put at the heart of decision-making? And isn't it the case that this Scottish Government will overturn community opposition because of their blind pursuit of net zero?
Douglas Lumsden, and
I hope they don't overturn it, because they need to listen to communities. There's communities here today. Maybe they can go and listen to them later on. Because all these questions, yet no one from this government is prepared to meet with them, look them in the eye and hear their concerns. As I said, some of them are here today, so they still have the opportunity. We know that the Cabinet Secretary has not met with them, have not heard their concerns, but meanwhile she has met with the companies who want to build these monster pylons. The First Minister, when asked by Tess White last year, was sure that ministers would meet, but no minister has had the bottle to. Shameful. Presiding Officer, not only does this government want to erect pylons in our communities, they also want to remove the right of residents to object through the planning system, watering down the voices of our residents and removing the right to a public inquiry. Not yet. Presiding Officer, in closing, this is one of the most important issues that we can and should be addressing in this chamber, and I'm genuinely pleased that the government has brought this today. We need more discussion about our energy future and the price many of our communities are having to pay. Nuclear should have a huge part to play in our energy future, and it would negate much of the need for monster pylons, ruining our countryside as we produce the energy closer to where it's required. But this anti-science devolved government want to turn their back on all of that. I'll give way briefly to Kevin Stewart.
Kevin Stewart.
I wonder if Mr Lumsden could explain how the electricity flows from the proposed nuclear power stations that he wants to see to people's homes across the country. Does he recognise that pylons play a part in the movement of electricity from nuclear power stations as well as from elsewhere?
Mr Lumsden, before you resume, I realise this is a debate that is going to excite a degree of emotion and passion. That is entirely predictable and indeed not undesirable. But we will listen to the member who has the floor rather than shouting from a sedentary position. Douglas Lumsden, to continue, I can give you the time back.
Thank you, President Officer. What Kevin Stewart doesn't understand that you actually build nuclear power stations closest to where the demand is. Then you negate all the need for pylons. Obviously has not got a clue about the electricity market. At a time of international uncertainty, we should be securing our energy supplies for the future with a credible mix of sources. This government is intent on closing doors to viable options based on far left-wing ideologies that hold little credible science. We should be producing our own oil and gas in the short term, investing in new technologies such as small nuclear reactors. We should be building our renewables sector, but listening to, working with communities to mitigate and properly compensate. Instead, this government is intent on using this debate today to score cheap political points, rather than actually deal... Well, are you laughing at these communities? They're here to see it. This is what the minister... You think it's funny? I bet... Oh.
Mr Lumsden, please resume your seat. Can I remind those in the public gallery, this is a meeting in public. It is not a public meeting. You should not be participating in the debate. Mr Lumsden, if you could start.
Thank you. I think it's shameful that the Minister is laughing at the people that have came down here to protest today, because only the Scottish Conservatives are standing up for the oil and gas sector. Only the Scottish Conservatives believe that we need an energy mix, and listening to the many voices here today who are living in the real world, not this cloud cuckoo land of anti-science nonsense. And I'm pleased to move the amendment in my name. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Sarah Boyack to speak to move Amendment 16657.2, around 7 minutes. Ms Boyack.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I do want to move the amendment in my name, in case I forget later on. When I first saw that the SNP government was holding a debate on renewable energy, I was really pleased. A great opportunity to have a debate on what we need to do to support the sector in terms of supply chains, training and manufacturing, to see the strategic infrastructure we need, whether it's investment in our ports or resilient grid infrastructure going forward. I was also thinking about the long-term delays in planning and what needs to happen to ensure that we get effective systems in terms of key government agencies so they have the resource to input effectively and in a timely fashion to major planning decisions. If it's brief.
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't have enough time to mention everything in my speech, but we have actually doubled the amount of people in the government's consent tuning so that we have consents going through within 52 weeks, and that's been welcomed by the sector.
Sarah Boyd.
Yeah, but they're worried about the fact that Berwick Bank, for example, is now over 2 years on the ministerial desk. We have a number of projects that are way over that timescale, so that issue is not fixed. And it's clearly an issue in relation to offshore projects, so I'd be very keen to hear when the consultation on the sectoral marine plan is going to be published. It's long delayed. I was also thinking it would be really useful to have a discussion about how we can maximise the use of our electricity produced by renewables, so we don't have to pay to turn off turbines and waste the energy. And that's long been an issue. And for example, the CABSEC mentioned hydro. We've had that for over 80 years. Now we've got pumped hydro storage, and that is inspiring. Gives us a more joined up system. The Acting Cabinet Secretary referenced the UK Climate Change Committee's recent recommendations on doing more to support heat pumps being installed. Well, the Scottish Government could take the lead and do more to support people, our constituents, who want to install solar, then battery and or heat pumps to decarbonise their homes. But no, that's not happening. And then there's the opportunities of using the next generation of wind turbines and floating wind to supply community heat networks. Our Nordic neighbours have used heat networks for decades to deliver affordable, low-carbon heat. And that's especially relevant given that our councils all submitted their LHE strategies over a year ago. I was thinking it would also be good to debate the community benefits referenced just a few minutes ago. We've seen that from renewables, but there's much more we can do to empower communities to develop more projects that will generate long-term jobs and investment locally, whether it's community, cooperatively or municipally owned heat and power going forward. But we need more effective leadership. Yes, briefly.
Fergus Ewing.
Many thanks for giving way. As far as communities benefiting, does Sarah Boyd agree with me that the ideal would be communities not just getting a cheque of 5k per megawatt per annum, but having a share, having a stake in the ownership, and that the governments working together in Scotland and the UK should be working together to deliver that?
Sarah Boyd.
Yeah, and that is exactly the principle behind GB Energy being established, the local power plan, working with the Scottish Government, but crucially our local councils too, because they're on the ground, they're in touch with communities, so having a share or ownership is absolutely crucial. I agree with that, but it's not an option for a lot of communities. And finally, I even wondered if today we'd see the publication of the Scottish Government's long-awaited Energy and Just Transition Plan. But no, apart from name-checking renewables, today's SNP motion is negative, ignores the contribution currently made by the nuclear sector and is in denial about the opportunities it could deliver. It's a retrograde motion. I don't pretend the world has not had nuclear safety issues historically, but safety standards are now internationally agreed and based on experience and is at the heart of the design of new SMRs. And it's vital that standards are met with monitoring, well-trained management and staff, and that safety is fundamental to the operation of nuclear power stations. So, should historic safety concerns mean that we rule out the contribution that nuclear power can make? I would be delighted to take an intervention on that point.
Minister.
I thank the member for giving way, and I merely ask, she mentions safety, whether she would be content to have a nuclear waste repository in her constituency.
Sarah Boy, I can give you the time.
Well, actually, just next door to my constituency, we have Torness Nuclear Power Station, which has been operating for decades. And the key issue is safe waste. The issue that people usually raise with me is waste in our waters, waste on our beaches. So we need to tackle waste right across our society. But I go back to that point. Our amendment is clear that we need to maximise the contribution of low-carbon energy technology, and to successfully transition to low and zero-carbon energy sources, we need to deliver energy security. We need a sustainable generation baseline, and for our view, nuclear generate has got to be part of the future energy mix. It's highly efficient. If it's brief.
Douglas Lumsden, briefly.
I think I will be brief. In terms of energy security, do you not feel then it's better that we actually produce our own oil and gas rather than rely on imports?
Through the chair, always Sarah Boyack.
Well, I think the thing is we're going to have our oil and gas for decades to come, and what we need is a joined-up approach. So, for example, floating wind, where we've got offshore oil and gas being produced, but we've got to have responsibility to the climate emergency. But it's hitching our constituents now. You talk to people up the North East, you look at the issue across the country about who's going to get insurance for their homes and their buildings, and we have got issues we need to be dealing with. So it's got to be a fair transition, and that's why I think nuclear's got to be part of that process. It's highly efficient, zero-emission source of energy that generates over 20% of the electricity we currently consume. High-skilled, well-paid, reliable jobs that generate income in those communities with a power plant. And there absolutely are lessons to be learned. I would very much agree with the failures we've seen down south over the last decade with nuclear stations and rising costs by the Tory government. But we need to learn from those experiences, not rule out the tech on principle. If we ruled out projects that didn't deliver on time, well, the Scottish Government would have some major challenges. And moreover, the development of SMRs is a game changer. They are now a real option, more economic, and deliver ongoing reliable electricity going forward. And as our amendment says, nuclear and renewables are not mutually exclusive. They're complementary parts to Scotland having a fossil fuel-free energy mix going forward. And if we don't take up this challenge, we're going to miss out economically. Our European neighbours have 12 nuclear plants at planning stages. We've got none. We've got one nuclear power station left in Scotland at Torness. Our workers on that site have kept the lights on and powered our country since the 80s. They deserve a future, a fair, just transition, and think of the benefits to construction. So we need to decarbonise our homes and buildings, our industrial sector, but do it in a way that supports our workers, that makes sure that they have jobs now and in the future. And that is what we need, benefiting our local communities. Today, that's not clearly what the SNP planned for. They want an argument, and well, that was very successful for the first 20 minutes. We need to work together because these are long-term decisions. We welcome the extension of the expansion of Torness's lifespan till 2028, keeping the skilled, the well-paid, unionised jobs in our local communities. Now, sorry, Presiding Officer, the light is flashing. I was told I had 9 minutes.
You were told you had 7 minutes.
All right, OK. So I've got... Right, I'll apologise then. The site had provided Scotland 146 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent emissions that we didn't have to need. Shouldn't we be out delivering a low-carbon future? Ed Miliband's clearly wants to work with the Scottish Government to deliver our clean power mission, and Anas Sarwar today said we should welcome the support from the UK Government for the next generation of nuclear energy technology and not see Scotland miss out. Let's have a joined-up approach. Let's see the Scottish Government delivering the leadership our renewables industry urgently need now, and let's look at a sustainable baseline of power. We urgently need a change of direction. Let's get on with it. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Boyack. I now call Patrick Harvey, around 6 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. There's a great deal to talk about, so I hope that the task of dismissing the argument for new nuclear is going to be the quick part of this speech. The Minister already mentioned cost, the massive upfront capital costs that have to be repaid over the operational lifetime mean that new nuclear will deliver energy at £109 per megawatt hour, compared with less than half of that, £44 for offshore wind, £41 for large-scale solar, and just £38 for onshore wind. On timescales, we know that emission cuts are needed quickly, and we know that nuclear is slow to deliver. That goes for big projects like Hinkley C, announced in 2010 and unlikely to operate before the 2030s after vast cost overrun. But it's also true for the idea of small modular reactors, which some nuclear lobbyists have a current love affair with. With designs and prototypes in development for decades, they are still not delivering on a commercial scale anywhere in the world. And if SMRs ever do end up delivering on their long-promised advantages, those advantages will depend on deployment at scale, including through standardised design models and minimising on-site construction. So not great for the jobs argument that some of these advocates are relying on either. As for the argument about baseload, if the task before us was simply to rebuild like for like a low-carbon version of the 20th century energy system, then the concept of baseload can't be avoided. But what we are actually seeing is the emergence of a new energy system based on diverse, decentralised renewable generation, demand reduction, large-scale deployment of new forms of energy storage, lots of interconnection for highly efficient long-distance electricity trading between markets, and smart technology to smooth the variability of both demand and supply. Was it Ms Boyack who...
Sarah Boyack.
About having a base load, absolutely we need renewables, but you also have intermittent renewables, and we have much more supply needed for electricity. So isn't it a win-win to do both?
Through the Chair, but Patrick Harvey.
And all of the range of technologies that I've just described are the reason why we are moving away from the world where that centralised baseload generation is required and a more diverse decentralised energy system. In short, the clean, secure, energy-efficient energy system that we need simply doesn't rely on nuclear. So let's look at where Scotland's advantages lie. We have a strong track record on renewables. Successive governments setting targets which many so-called experts dismissed, said renewables will never generate that much. Those targets were successively exceeded. We're now generating more in renewable electricity than the electricity we consume in some years. We have skills in oil and gas which can transfer to many new industries, including in areas like green hydrogen, if the government, both governments, are proactive, because we know that the oil and gas companies won't be. But Scotland also has many areas where we need to catch up on lost ground. We waste too much energy, and we still construct our buildings as though energy is cheap to use. There have been improvements in energy efficiency standards in new build, but this has to go further, and we have to start treating investment in the energy efficiency of existing buildings as a national strategic infrastructure priority. We rely too much on private ownership and not enough on public and community ownership. There's a strong case for an ambitious target for the amount of wholly community-owned renewable energy in Scotland, and priority access to land for community energy to make that target a reality. And the government must put support in place for community projects to access the capital that they need for repowering, and commercial repowering must also deliver community benefit, just as new-build commercial wind should. And that's in addition to the need to learn from the best of Denmark's experience, building for 50 years heat networks and doing it for public benefit, not for private profit, and protecting their energy consumers. With communities owning their own heat infrastructure as well as renewable generating capacity, we don't need to replicate an energy system that extracts profit from people in fuel poverty. I don't have time, I'm afraid. We have an energy system still that is regulated as though for the 20th century. Renewable electricity is the cheapest power to generate. It should be the cheapest to consume. But the way the UK regulates the energy market artificially increases its price to consumers and acts as a barrier to people shifting away from fossil fuels for heat and transport. And we also finally have a gap between the political desire to be seen as climate leaders and the political courage to act. Despite our strong track record on renewables, there's been little to no progress on other sectors: land, buildings, transport, and now we see a series of delays. The Energy Strategy and Just Transition Plan. I've seen suggestions that the legal rulings on the unlawful approval of Rosebank and Jackdaw has some way led to the delay. That can only be the case if the government proposes to actually express positive support for those unlawfully approved developments. And as for the heat and buildings bill, one of the most obvious areas where we don't just need to cut emissions, but to deploy systems that can use renewable electricity to displace fossil fuels, do so at scale and do so in a way that will cut people's bills. This was accelerating in the first 2 years of the current parliamentary session, and the bill was on track to introduce before the end of last year. Now it's absent with no explanation. Presiding Officer, in closing, renewables growth didn't happen by magic. Scotland was successful because successive governments gave clear and consistent signals to innovators, to investors, to the workforce and to policymakers that Scotland was serious about renewables. That's the clarity that we need on the clean heat sector, for building owners, for investors, for installers and those who train them, and for the businesses who are innovating in new systems. And the benefit in terms of jobs, reduced bills, emission cuts and energy security are there for the taking, but only if the Scottish Government ends the delay, commits to a truly ambitious agenda and puts that bill before Parliament now.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. And I now call Alex Cole-Hamilton up to around 6 minutes, please.
I am very grateful indeed for the opportunity to speak for the Liberal Democrats in today's debate. And, Presiding Officer, Scotland has, as we've heard several times today, the potential to lead the world. When it comes to clean energy and its production. And the need to take advantage of that opportunity is underscored by what we were discussing earlier today, and that is our energy security, the volatile global situation and volatile markets that we've seen in recent years. Regardless of our views on nuclear energy, I'm sure we can all agree that the importance of renewable energy to Scotland's decarbonisation journey should not be understated. Renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy generation. It can be installed at scale, and crucially, it provides that energy independence which reduces our reliance on imported fuels and insulates us from volatile global markets and threats to our energy security. As we all know, Scotland has the potential to be a renewables powerhouse. It's been said in this chamber many times. We have wind, we have the waves, the technology, and we have the ambition. The challenge ahead is not just about how we generate it, but it's how we ensure that energy is abundant, clean and affordable for all. The UK's renewable energy generation has increased significantly since 2010, and 70% of electricity generated in Scotland is from renewable technology. This is his progress, and we should be glad of it. I'll take a brief intervention from Douglas Lumsden.
Brief. Can I just ask the member if he's content, or if the Liberal Democrats are content, that our countryside is being covered with pylons, substations and batteries?
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
We'll come onto the grid in more depth, but Douglas Lumsden is right to raise the impact on our communities of energy transmission, and it's certainly something I think SSEN could do more to bring hearts and minds of communities with them, rather than the path of least resistance that they seem to be adopting at the moment. He'll be aware of my party's support for several community-led campaigns, particularly in the far north. But this is great progress, but we need to go much further if we are to meet our net zero targets. And the Climate Change Committee has been clear the United Kingdom must accelerate the deployment of renewable and grid infrastructure to reach a decarbonised power system by 2035. At present, we're just not moving fast enough. And, Presiding Officer, we're going to see higher still demand for electricity use as we change the way we move around to electrically powered transport, and indeed the way we power our homes. Have I got decent time?
I can give time back.
Right,
I've
got two. I'll take Martin Whitfield.
Martin Whitfield.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful to Alex Cole-Hamilton to give way. On the question of renewables and the intermittent nature, even if we take, the very best pump hydro, that can provide but 50 hours. And when we're talking about an increase in demand on electricity, how does he see that gap between? How does the member see the gap between that being filled?
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm going to come on to storage in a minute, but I think we have a job to do, first on pump hydro, but also on battery storage as well. I will also take Fergus Ewing, if I have time, Presiding Officer.
Fergus Ewing.
You're live. Sorry, Presiding Officer. Thank you for taking my intervention, Mr Cole-Hamilton. Do you agree with me that the process does need to be speeded up if we are to, as he rightly argues, but that to do that, the Scottish and UK Government should have a standing committee where they issue clear mandates to the plethora of public bodies, all of whom are involved one way or the other in the process. Otherwise, there's not really any chance that targets set by either governments can conceivably be met?
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I thank Fergus Ewing for his intervention. I think his point is typically well made. He's right. I mean, there is, I think, a great deal of bureaucracy in this landscape. I think there is unnecessary delay, and particularly around the upgrade of the grid and our efforts to transmit this abundant energy needs to be a national work of endeavour, which can't be held back by the things he's described. And a major obstacle to the energy transition is Scotland's grid. It was designed for a system dominated by large, centralised power stations. The future of energy, however, as we all know, is local, is distributed, it's flexible. The failure to invest in that grid is already holding back renewables in a way that I think Fergus Ewing was alluding to. And we've heard in recent years how wind farms are being paid hundreds of millions of pounds through constraint payments, presiding officer, to switch their turbines off when they cannot be absorbed into the grid the electricity they are producing. This is money coming directly out of people's pockets, simply because our infrastructure can't keep up. At a time when people's bills are soaring, this just feels insane. We need to do better. We need a modern, smart grid that can handle variable renewable generation, connect Scotland's energy production with the rest of the United Kingdom and Europe, and integrate energy storage solutions. Without it, we'll not be able to meet our energy security or affordability goals. Scotland's energy future must also include expansion in energy storage. The wind doesn't always blow. The sun doesn't always shine. To make the most of our vast renewable potential, we must invest in large-scale storage, as I think Martin Whitfield was right to highlight, including pumped hydro and battery technology. The tech exists, it's just not there at scale. And within that context, we must also consider the role of nuclear power. Scottish Liberal Democrats have always championed an evidence-based approach to decarbonising energy generation, one that helps us to reach net zero while meeting Scotland's energy needs safely and affordably. And the same commitment to rigorous assessment must apply to all future energy technologies, including new generations of nuclear power. Any evaluation of nuclear power must be based on clear evidence, considering the full life cycle of a technology from construction to decommissioning and long-term legacy. Currently, no small modular reactors are operational for power generation, and with dozens of different designs under development worldwide, it remains impossible to conduct a fair and comprehensive assessment of their costs, their environmental impacts and their risks. And the developers of SMRs or any other form of new nuclear would need to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that their technology is effective, safe, clean and value for money, and carries with it the good wishes of their communities. Crucially, investment in research must not come at the expense of the renewables sector, which already delivers clean, cheaper, faster energy solutions. Presiding officer, Scotland is well placed to lead on the energy transition of our world-class universities. Engineering expertise and industrial base provide a strong foundation for advancing cutting-edge technologies. But to truly harness these opportunities, the Scottish and UK governments must go further, work together by ramping up investment in renewables, unlocking green jobs and creating a more prosperous and sustainable energy future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to the open debate. I call Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Graham Simpson. Around 6 minutes. Ms Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I seem to be speaking a lot about energy recently, and that's not just the scheduled debates. Energy bills are a pressing concern for folk right across Scotland. Thousands upon thousands of folk are struggling to pay them, and many who would have been comfortable just a few years ago are now feeling the pinch. And if folk weren't scunnered enough, they'll just have heard the news that their bills are due to go up again. In my own Donside constituency, every single day during this winter, I have heard folks' experiences of fuel poverty. Even in the energy capital of Europe, folk cannot afford their energy bills. That needs to change, and that needs to change soon. People are not willing to wait 2 decades for their energy bills to go down, and I believe that's the timeline for a new nuclear power station to be planned and constructed in the UK. It's also a timeline that I don't think delivers for thousands of my constituents who rely upon the energy sector for their livelihoods, and I won't miss any opportunity to shoehorn in a call for more funding and support for a just transition and to keep making the case for these workers' futures. To my mind, For so many of those workers, their future is Scotland's renewable future. We have the energy, we just need the power. Actually, we just don't have the energy, we have the people as well, and we need to keep them. Since the 1970s, we've been able to assemble one of the best workforces in the world, from training folk locally to encouraging them to move here from far and wide. And we've had a little bit of an advantage because not that many places have oil. Many of the other places that do have harsh climates or political regimes that are based on different values to our own. While it may feel like we have more wind than most and our coastline offers huge opportunities, we have to recognise that everywhere has sun, wind and water. Looking ahead, we're now truly competing against the world. If we're going to seize the opportunity to become a net zero capital, then we need to act now. We have a huge head start, though, with the amazing workforce that we have. Some of their skills may not match perfectly with what's needed, but Aberdeen has a long history of being able to improvise and adapt. Presiding Officer, our city has been weathered by the North Sea. It's carved out of granite. It established itself as Europe's oil and gas capital through tremendous engineering feats that saw us extracting oil 100 miles off our coast from miles beneath the surface. Aberdeen has helped to shape the modern world, and it will do so again in the move to net zero. Because, of course, we are the future net zero capital of the world, so the next chapter in Aberdeen's story is going to see us harness the energy of Mother Nature herself. To make that happen, though, a number of things have to happen. Investment. Investment in green skills, in the supply chain, in a just transition and in giving the Acorn project the green light. We need certainty. New technologies need price guarantees and the whole industry has been calling for tax certainty. No other industry sees their taxes vary to the extent they have in the energy industry over the last few years. Finally, migration. We have a track record of assembling the best workforce in the world, but employers across my constituency have told me they are struggling with the visa rules that are in place just now. I'll take an intervention from Mr Kerr. If he's going to speak about nuclear power stations, I'd like to ask him where it's going to go in his region.
Stephen Kerr.
Well, I'm going to speak about nuclear power stations, but it's not my turn to speak yet. I'm intervening on what you have said, Jackie Dunbar, what Jackie Dunbar has said. I'm interested in her claim, rightly, that we need to invest in skills. How exactly does an SNP Scottish Government invest in skills while slashing the budgets of the college sector? How does that happen? How will that happen if you're not investing in college education and you're not increasing the number of apprenticeship places in Scotland?
Always through the chair, Jackie Dunbar,
and give you the time back. We have a £500 million Just Transition Fund which will see and help our workers in the north east of Scotland and Moray. That is one way of doing it. Presiding Officer, let's look at the contrast of the alternative. We could dither about for decades to plan and build nuclear power stations and then likely take decades longer to break even. It's estimated that Hinkley Point C's construction will cost about £46 billion in today's money for just one plant. And I don't for one second believe that MSPs in this chamber who have campaigned against pylons in their constituencies and regions would be willing to welcome a new nuclear power point in their patches. I'll take an intervention from anyone at this point wanting to campaign for a nuclear power plant in their area they represent. If folk, Mr Whitfield, please tell me where nuclear power station.
I'm more than happy for Torness B to be built in the south of Scotland constituency of East Lothian.
Jackie Dunbar.
Can I speak? Presiding Officer, I'm aware I've only got 10 seconds left. And Mr Kerr, you may laugh, but I have taken your intervention and I've taken Mr Whitfield.
Through the chair, I can give you a little extra time for the interventions, Ms Dunbar.
Yeah. If folk, as I said, if folk truly believe in nuclear, they will actually, and I'm grateful for Mr Whitfield actually for owning his, but can I remind members that nuclear power stations, as Mr Stewart said earlier, need pylons to carry electricity, and I believe it was the former Tory government that denied the opportunity of them going underground because it would cost far too much money. I want to see Scotland becoming a hub for clean, green, cheap, renewable energy. I want to see a just transition for the North East, and I want to see Aberdeen becoming the net zero capital of the world. And I want to see my constituents no longer struggling to heat their homes. That's why I want to see, and the way to realise that is a renewable future. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, sir. I call Graham Simpson to be followed by Audrey Nicholl around 6 minutes. Mr Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We can often in debates like this get bogged down in arguments about oil and gas versus renewables, about net zero versus no net zero, and in the case of the government motion, nuclear versus renewables. But it's not as simple as that. The truth is, I think there's more common ground than people would like to let on, even Mr Lumsden. This could have been a positive debate about renewables because there's a good story to tell there. Instead, it's a dial the clock back 50 years debate against nuclear, so let me tackle that one first. The SNP government's view, which we've known about for years, so we don't need a debate about it, is that Scotland should not build new nuclear because the electricity produced is expensive. But that does not consider the cost of intermittency, that's the wind not always blowing, or the cost of transmission. Scotland has the most expensive transmission network in the UK because lots of wind is generated in rural areas very far from where it's needed. Stable, predictable, geographically concentrated nuclear is much more straightforward to transmit. Wind energy is available only 45% of the time and it requires backup from gas. Nuclear is available 90% of the time and is therefore more reliable. Now, Germany, Austria and Belgium have seen their carbon emissions rise after the decommissioning of nuclear plants. NESO's advice to the UK government to advise on how GB can achieve green power by 2030 included contracting more offshore wind capacity, increasing battery capacity, the delivery of carbon capture and nuclear power. And the Climate Change Committee has previously suggested a target of 10 gigawatts of nuclear by 2025. Now, I don't often agree with Keir Starmer, but he was right when he said, quotes, "This country hasn't built a nuclear power station in decades. We've been let down and left behind. Our energy security has been hostage to Putin for too long, with British prices skyrocketing at his whims. I'm putting an end to it." That's Keir Starmer, changing the rules to back the builders of this nation and saying no to the blockers who've strangled our chances of cheaper energy, growth and jobs for far too long. Hostage to Putin. Is that what we really want? I mentioned Germany. It's a great example of why countries should not phase out nuclear. Germany now burns more coal than anyone else in Europe to cover its electricity needs when the wind and sun are down. German industrial electricity prices and domestic electricity prices are some of the very highest in the EU, about 30 to 50% higher than in France, which gets 70% of its electricity from nuclear. To German industrial competitiveness is suffering from persistent high electricity prices caused by nuclear phase-out. This motion is an example of why we need a change of government in Scotland. Now let me turn to renewables, because there is some positivity. Yes, indeed.
Mr Jamie Hepburn.
Mr Simpson ostensibly represents the same people I do in this place. Cumbernauld South is, of course, to the Central Scotland region. He's advocating a new generation of nuclear power stations. Is he suggesting it should be in Cumbernauld or Kilsyth? Is he suggesting it should be anywhere in the Central Scotland region he represents? Because we're hearing there should be new stations. Where should they be? Where should they be?
Graham Simpson, I can give you the time back.
Well, when I'm thinking of where nuclear power stations are, and if the Minister can stop interrupting from a sedentary position, I'll get the answer out. They're mostly by the coast. Yeah. Central Scotland. Just, think about it.
Yeah, what coast is there?
The recent report from the Energy and Climate Energy Unit and CBI Economics showed that Scotland has seen the UK's highest growth in economic activity from net zero businesses since 2022, with the green sector growing at breakneck speed by a fifth. Renewables make up 4.9% of the Scottish economy, generating £9.1 billion in GVA for Scotland. Over the same period, total employment supported by the net zero economy in Scotland has grown 19.5%, or the equivalent of 16,500 full-time jobs. But the question posed by Douglas Lumsden, and I'm worried about Mr Lumsden's blood pressure on many occasions, but certainly today, but he was right when he said, do we put all our eggs in one basket? And the answer to that must be no. Energy security and getting bills down has to be a priority. The oil and gas sector supports 83,700 jobs. We can't just shut it down. Everyone in this chamber wants Grangemouth in my region to survive, but they should reflect on their relentlessly negative stance on what it produces. Now, if we accept that we need more electricity, then we have to get it from A to B. There can be no transition without transmission, and that's going to mean Scotland being a key part of that journey, with billions of pounds invested and the potential to unlock wider economic growth. But it must be done with community involvement. Presiding Officer, the government's
Mr Simpson's bringing his remarks to a close.
I'm just finishing. The government's bizarre motion should be rejected. We need a mix of electricity supply, and Scotland should play its part in that.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. I now call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by Paul Sweeney. Ms Nicholl.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I'm always very pleased to speak in any debate on energy. And as a North East MSP, today's debate on Scotland's renewable future is no exception. Scotland's offshore energy industry has been a success story for over 50 years, and while there's no need to rehearse our energy mix as shifting from oil and gas, it is worth repeating the tax regime connected to Scotland's energy industry has seen hundreds of billions of pounds of tax revenue flow to the UK government. So Scotland has done its share of heavy lifting, heating our homes and businesses and keeping the lights on, and I hope that continues. But, as they say, progress is impossible without change, and we're now on a different trajectory with a unique opportunity to repurpose our energy sector through our managed just transition. And as the Deputy First Minister set out last week in a debate on increasing investment in Scotland, renewable energy generation reached a record high in the first half of 2024, and Scotland's net zero sector has grown by more than 20% since 2022. And according to the Fraser of Allender Institute, Scotland's renewable energy industry supports more than 42,000 jobs and an economic output of more than £10.1 billion in 2021. The UK's net zero industry is growing 3 times faster than the overall UK economy, generating over £83 billion for the UK in 2024. I call that a success story. And some of that success is visible in my constituency of Aberdeen South and North Kincardine. And one business with over 40 years of deep water experience is scaling up its testing of offshore platform technology, offering really important opportunities for foundation manufacturing in Scotland. Another business in the hydrogen storage space sector is developing a new type of hydrogen storage vessel to support projects requiring a method of moving hydrogen to their end users. And currently there is no UK or Scottish manufacturer of this type of storage vessel. They're all currently imported. And Port of Aberdeen continues on its journey to create an international hub for offshore wind, including further deepening South Harbour. And of course, the brilliant Net Zero Technology Centre TechX Accelerator programme supports unbelievable talent in clean energy startups, which continue their journey to accelerate the transition to a net zero industry. Of course, there are challenges across planning, regulatory processes and financial mechanisms, and that last point has been raised with me by several businesses recently that are seeking to expand and that would like to see a clearer shared investment strategy between the Scottish and UK governments that will provide confidence to underpin the level of investment that they require to unlock their infrastructure projects. And this is particularly relevant to our ports infrastructure, including Port of Aberdeen, to enable them to support floating offshore wind. And I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister for their respective engagement on this. And I also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's acknowledgement that the good practice principles must be improved and community benefit ramped up. Football shirts and pocket parks just don't cut it. But I would remind Mr Lumsden that it was Mr Lumsden who inserted the development of an industrial development on a treasured green space in my constituency known as St Fittick's Park with absolutely no consultation when he was a council leader in Aberdeen City. So we must all be genuine in our commentary around community benefit. And at the cross-party group on renewable energy last week, we heard about the concerning issue of zonal pricing, currently being considered by the UK Government as part of its energy pricing mechanism review. And we also heard industry bodies, trade unions and investors are very concerned that it will have a material impact on the scale of the renewables sector's investment in Scotland and our ability to drive key projects and unlock jobs and the supply chain here. And I would very much welcome an update from the Scottish Government on their position in their summing, on their position on this in the Minister's summing up. And related to this, reducing energy bills sits at the heart of our energy thinking, and the very detailed briefing from SSE sets out the challenges of our antiquated and absurd electricity charging system very well, referencing the Scottish Renewables analysis that an average 1 gigawatt Scottish offshore wind project would pay £38 million a year to use the electricity network, while an identical wind farm in the congested seas off England's south coast would actually be paid a £7 million payment for the same service. Utterly unbelievable. So this regime needs urgent reform. I very briefly take your intervention.
Maurice Golden, briefly.
If the member can articulate how much consumers would pay under this scenario.
Audrey Nicholl.
I thank the member for that intervention. I don't know, but I would imagine that, and I would certainly hope that it would certainly not be any more, hopefully less. So this segues me into my final position on nuclear power, shaped in no small part by my working-class parents who saw this energy option as an insult to Scotland. The debate on nuclear has moved on, and while the new UK Government continues with its plans to boost nuclear power in England and Wales, I fail to understand the rationale for supporting an energy source that produces vast quantities of waste, takes decades to reduce to safe levels of radioactivity, it's vastly more expensive than renewables, it takes decades to build, cannot be switched on and off easily, and is potentially dangerous and contaminating. And I agree with the point that Patrick Harvey made. We must all also get real about our own behaviour in our energy use. So to conclude, nuclear is not an option for Scotland. An exciting future supporting a world-leading renewables industry is. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Nicholl. I now call Paul Sweeney to be followed by Karen Adam. Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think I share the aspirations across the Chamber that Scotland has huge potential to lead the way in the renewable future. In fact, it's just unfortunate that we have been such a laggard to this point and the huge opportunities that we have missed over generations is really quite frustrating. I look, for example, at the contrast in the fortunes of Denmark's Vestas to Scotland's Howden. If you take that as one case study, 35 years ago, in fact, the very year I was born, Scotland exited the manufacturing of wind turbines in 1989, and the works which built those pioneering wind turbines now lies derelict on the south side of Glasgow. It could have been a huge opportunity if we had persevered with more state investment in wind turbines at the early stage, and now we see the huge advantage that other countries have achieved in stitching up the global supply chain for wind turbines. Our particularly harsh weather, extensive coastline and thousands of lochs mean that Scotland boasts a unique environment, certainly, that is well suited to the installation of wind, hydroelectric and tidal power. I just wish we were making more of the infrastructure that is required. That being said, I think it is also irresponsible for the government here in Scotland not to support a new generation of nuclear energy as part of this mix. Britain, and indeed Scotland, was of course the world's first civil generator of nuclear power with Calder Hall and Chapel Cross in the 1950s. But unfortunately that industrial leadership was lost through a lack of planning and the break-up of our vertically integrated electricity generation and transmission system in the 1990s. I think the ideological opposition of the government to new nuclear power stations is holding Scotland back from potentially billions of pounds of investment in thousands of highly skilled jobs. And it doesn't have to be an either-or. This is a false dichotomy. We can be a clean energy superpower both by the harnessing of renewable technologies and new civil nuclear power working in concert. After all, it's clear that intermittency is the fundamental challenge with particularly wind turbine installations, with wind power technology only available 25% to 45% of the time, while nuclear energy providing a 90% stable baseload supply. So that means that you're able to augment intermittency with that stable baseline. That's the fundamental reconciliation that's needed. And I think when we discuss nuclear power, we're often haunted by past generations of nuclear reactor technologies. Even Hinkley Point C is a technology that I don't think is appropriate for Scotland. The European pressurised water reactor technology is what was described as a Cambridge professor Routling as a cathedral within a cathedral, an over-engineered system that is already obsolete, and technology has already evolved. New, cleaner and neater options are available today and actually help to repower existing nuclear sites in Scotland, such as Torness and Hunterston. Rolls-Royce have developed... happy to give way, yes?
Edward Mountain.
I thank the member for taking an intervention, and of course he's so right. I need only to look on the 3rd of November, where 50% of our energy came from gas, 30% nuclear and 3% from wind. Can the member explain to me why this government is so against nuclear, except when the wind doesn't blow, and they're prepared to accept nuclear power from France to keep the lights on in Scotland?
Paul Sweeney.
I think the member highlights the fallacy and the logical inconsistency at the heart of the government's position. And I think it's largely a sunk cost fallacy that they've been so wedded to this position for so long that it's hard for them to walk back from it. As I mentioned, Rolls-Royce have developed a new small modular reactor technology which is around a third of the size of second-generation nuclear plants such as the existing advanced gas-cooled reactor fleet in Scotland. And that would provide ability to use the existing turbine plant at those sites and to repower them at a fraction of the capital cost, as was suggested, building a new nuclear power station from scratch. But also SMRs are well suited to replace fossil fuel fire plants. I mean, for example, Longannet had the same generator plant as Hunterston and Torness. It was a shame it was dynamited and cleared. It could have been repowered using SMRs. So we can actually utilise more of these sites and do it more efficiently. And it's also really disappointing to learn that the Scottish Government in 2022 fundamentally rejected any proposal from INEOS and Rolls-Royce to power Grangemouth refinery using a small modular reactor. We know that the reason why petrochemicals in this country are becoming fast and competitive is because of the throttling of competitive manufacturing in this country due to high gas prices, which drive our electricity costs. So we must avoid other missed opportunities like this and move to a more pragmatic approach to nuclear energy being part of that mix. Mr Simpson, of course, mentioned Germany as a good warning sign for what could happen in the UK and is indeed happening with the high industrial energy costs that we have. And I think we also have to take cognizance of what one of our best ever engineers told us over a decade ago, and the late Sir Donald Miller told us that when he retired from South of Scotland Electricity Board in the early 1990s, he could take a great deal of satisfaction from the fact that Scotland had one of the most secure and cost-effective systems of electricity generation worldwide. Some 60% of our energy was from nuclear, and with the hydro we could incidentally also claim to have one of the greenest systems with the lowest carbon emissions. And the coal-fired station at Longannet, which was recently decommissioned, was a groundbreaker when built and was used mainly for backup and profitable exports to England for the benefit of Scottish consumers. And that today we see a very different picture. The decommissioning of our conventional generation is fast approaching, indeed it is already approached, and yet there are no plans to replace the generating capacity at Longannet or the nuclear. And even more incomprehensible is that we shall in a few years be importing power for much of the time from the new nuclear stations to be built just over the border in England. And you may wonder why Scotland, the birthplace of so much engineering and a pioneer of nuclear energy, should be importing the power we could well generate here, exporting highly skilled jobs in the process, and moreover ending up with the least reliable and most insecure electricity supply we have seen for 100 years. And all of this at a time when electricity has never been more important in the lifeblood of modern society. Deputy Presiding Officer, I think the late Donald Miller's words ring very true today, and it was rather prophetic of him to say that 10 years ago. I wish the Government would take more cognizance of the expertise in this country and harness it to deliver a true industrial renaissance for this country.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. I now call Karen Adam to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Ms Adam.
Officer. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, Scotland's energy future is in renewables, and nowhere is that clearer than in my constituency of Banffshire and Buchan Coast. My communities have powered Scotland for a generation, and that's through fishing, energy, and now the opportunities with a just transition. But like all industries, this transition cannot be something done to the people, it must be done with them. We have everything that we need right here. That's wind, water and a skilled workforce. And if we get this right, we don't just keep the lights on. We build a sustainable future where our communities benefit from real investment and lasting opportunities. Yes, I will.
Douglas Lumsden.
Member for taking an intervention. We've heard that ministers refuse to meet community groups. Will Karen Adam go and meet community groups? Many in her constituency who have real concerns about pylon substations and batteries. Karen Adam.
I regularly meet community groups, and if anyone emails me asking for a meeting, I will meet them. But I think it was Alistair Allen clearly set out earlier that they are not permitted to meet with these community groups. It is not allowed. So I really don't want his words to be twisted there. So our focus should be on our renewables and not on nuclear, which is slow, costly and ultimately a bad deal for Scotland. The Government's nuclear projects are billions over budget and years behind schedule, forcing taxpayers ultimately to foot that bill. Meanwhile, Scotland's renewables are delivering right now, providing clean energy, cutting costs and creating jobs. And we can't afford to waste time anymore looking backwards. As we move forward with offshore wind, we must also stand with the people whose lives and livelihoods revolve around Scotland's seas. And that's why I established the cross-party group on fisheries and coastal communities, because fishers deserve a seat at that table too. And I thank the Cabinet Secretary, Gillian Martin, for attending one of our cross-party meetings. It was greatly appreciated. The fishers don't just work the sea, they know it, and their knowledge of the waters, ecosystems and realities of the industry cannot be ignored. Offshore wind and other developments must be done with them and not to them. And being serious about a just transition, we must engage early, listen properly and respect generations of expertise, not bring them in as an afterthought when the plans are signed off. This is an industry that puts low-carbon, high-protein diets on our plates, and that does matter. But there's one company really showing how this can be done well, and that's Ocean Winds. I've met with their team regularly, most recently at an event I hosted here in the Parliament. With Moray East and Moray West, they are set to become the largest offshore wind operator in the country. Their Moray West operations and maintenance base in Buckie is proof of what real investment in renewables can do. A few short years ago, Buckie Harbour looked quite different to what it looks like now. It's bringing in new businesses, new jobs and new opportunities. And that is the real-world impact of renewables. But opportunity doesn't come without some challenges. Higher transmission charges are making it more expensive for our offshore wind developers in Scotland to connect to the grid than anywhere else in the UK. And these additional costs could slow our investment. That is unacceptable. And if we want to unlock the full potential of offshore wind, we need a fairer system, one that doesn't penalise Scotland for leading the way. Another key issue is harbour and port capacity building, and that's why Fraserburgh Harbour and other ports across my constituency are critical to this conversation. Fraserburgh has big ambitions, and I meet regularly with Pamela Neri and her team, championing the harbour master plan every chance I get. And if we back Fraserburgh properly, it can become a major hub for offshore wind, strengthening supply chains, securing long-term prosperity and creating jobs that are needed for our local communities. Presiding Officer, when we talk about a just transition, we need to remember what that really means. And it's not just about energy, it's about the people. It's about valuing the industries and expertise we already have and making sure they have a future in the low-carbon Scotland. And that means listening to our fishers, it means investing in our ports, and we have an incredible opportunity to be a hub of manufacturing, for example, linking in with local colleges and schools to support the supply chain with a labour force, ensuring that renewables create jobs and prosperity in the communities that need it most. Yet while Scotland pushes forward, Labour and the Tories would throw billions at nuclear despite it being slow, expensive and out of reach for ordinary folk. The track record speaks for itself. Projects like Hinkley Point that have been mentioned before, billions over budget and years behind schedule, and still nowhere near delivering energy. Meanwhile, Scotland's renewables are already cutting costs and creating jobs. So why would we choose outdated, overpriced and unreliable technology over a proven homegrown industry? Scotland is leading, not just in clean energy, but in showing the world what a fair, inclusive transition looks like. And yet last week, the Conservatives voted against the Scottish Government's budget, which included £237 million for ports and harbours. That is unacceptable. And I am proud to have voted for more investment in our coastal communities. But we must not stop here. Just let's get this right. Let's power on with our renewables for Scotland, for our coastal communities, and ultimately for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Adam. I now call Stephen Kerr to be followed by Fergus Ewing. Mr Kerr.
Well, Presiding Officer, it's a pleasure to follow Karen Adam, but she needs to realise that when we vote for a budget, we don't get to pick and choose which lines in the budget we're going to support. We have to take it as a whole. Now, it was Winston Churchill that once said, he's already been quoted by Fergus Ewing in this debate, the pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. And the SNP government is nothing if it isn't pessimistic. At every turn they block progress, stifle ambition, cling to outdated dogma and ideology. Well, it's time for Scotland to start seeing the opportunities before us. And I agree with Graham Simpson on this. It is going to take a change of Scottish government for that to happen. The SNP will not change. And that change that we're looking for means embracing nuclear technology. It's the very opposite of the motion in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. And that would be part of our clean, secure and prosperous future. But the SNP and the Greens want to take Scotland down a dead-end road where energy insecurity, high prices and economic decline await us. Their opposition to nuclear power is based not on science or economics. It is based solely on ideology. I recently met young Scottish apprentices working in the nuclear sector. They were bright, they were ambitious, they were highly skilled. Their futures were exciting. They were at the forefront of an industry that offers some of the best paid, most secure and most future-proof jobs in the world. I will take an intervention.
Karen Adam.
Just on that, on the point of economic opportunities, the CBI reported last week that net zero industry is growing 3 times faster than the overall UK economy, providing high-wage jobs and boosting energy security. What does the member say to that in response?
Stephen Kerr.
I say we can have it all in Scotland. We can have it all. It's not either or. And I go back to my young Scottish apprentices. The sad reality in the indictment of this so-called nationalist government, it's a very strange nationalism, this, because if they want to pursue their careers, they have to leave Scotland. That's not just bad policy, that is a betrayal of Scotland's future. If If we are serious about cutting emissions, getting energy prices lower and securing thousands of skilled jobs for generations to come, then we must invest in nuclear energy, and in particular in SMRs. Nuclear is now one of the safest, most reliable and cleanest energy sources in the world. SMRs are quicker to build. There's a lot of propaganda about how long it takes. They're quicker to build, they're cheaper to operate, and they're far more flexible. I will give way to the Minister.
Grateful to the member giving way. He mentions that the idea that it might take a while to build nuclear power stations in Scotland to address our energy needs is simply propaganda. How long does he think it might take?
Stephen Kerr.
It shows that SMRs can be built in between 7 and 10 years. That's very realistic. Very realistic. And that's why we shouldn't be turning up our noses in Scotland to SMRs. They use... I will give one time again. I'll give way.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank the member for giving way on that point. Does he recognise that, for example, a reactor pressure vessel for an SMR could be built at Rosyth and then taken by barge to Torness and connected to the existing turbine holder, and it would be a fairly easy job to do in relative terms?
Stephen Kerr.
I bow before the expertise of Paul Sweeney on these matters, but that sounds exciting to me. That sounds like the kind of future that I want for Scotland and for the future of the people that will live in Scotland. These SMRs use less space than wind farms, can be located close to where the power is needed, and that is critical in relation to the controversies over transmission. Nuclear power stations can be built nearer to where the power will be used, and they run 24/7. They're not weather dependent when the sun doesn't shine. We've heard that countless times in this debate. They are the perfect complement to intermittent renewables like wind and solar, and they create thousands of high-quality jobs from engineering and construction to operations and maintenance. And here's the kicker. The UK government, both the Conservative one and this Labour one, already back SMRs. But where's the SNP? Standing in the way. Billions of pounds of investment and talent that could flow into Scotland if we got behind nuclear, boosting our economy instead of watching investment and talent heading out of Scotland to England, Wales or abroad. Scottish businesses and universities could lead in nuclear innovation, attracting global talent and cementing our place as a leader in clean energy technology. But instead of grasping these opportunities, the SNP banned nuclear outright, shutting Scotland out of a rapidly expanding, exciting global industry. The United States, China, Canada and the EU countries investing heavily in nuclear, but not Scotland. Meanwhile, the SNP wants to cling on, I think for comfort, as they sink to their outdated 1970s anti-nuclear rhetoric, while pretending that renewables alone can meet all of Scotland's energy needs. They are failing Scotland's workers, offering them false promises of green jobs without delivering real long-term opportunities. They are failing Scotland's households. They are failing future generations. If we're serious about a secure, low-carbon and prosperous future, then we must embrace a balanced energy mix, one that combines renewables, oil and gas for transition and nuclear, and that means lifting Scotland's nuclear ban and allowing SMRs to be built in Scotland close to where the power is needed. That means supporting nuclear apprenticeships.
Mr Kerr, you need to conclude.
I will. That means making Scotland a leader in nuclear innovation. How on earth can you call...
Right, I now call Fergus Ewing to be followed by Emma Harper. Mr Ewing.
When I had the privilege of being the Energy Minister in Scotland for 5 years from 2011, I was honoured to breakfast in Orkney in a visit to EMEC, accompanied by the great Norwegian Fred Olsen. And he gave me some advice then, which remained with me and helped us shape our then policy, which is that Scotland, having deeper waters than the south of England, will find over time that the costs of constructing offshore wind farms will be far greater if they were fixed to the seabed in Scotland, because they have to be set because the seabed is deeper than the south of England, and therefore, over time, floating offshore wind would give Scotland an innate advantage. and not least because they can be located to take advantage of different wind directions. And therefore, when the wind is not blowing in one direction, the floating wind turbines can be relocated to the most efficacious location from the point of view of generation. And it was, the Hywind project was the first in the world commercial array of floating offshore, and I'm indebted to my friend Halfdan Bustad of Equinor for ensuring that some work came to Global Energy for part of that project, although I do query how much of the value will accrue to Scotland over time in renewables. I'm bound to reflect, Presiding Officer, as we discussed Ukraine earlier today, that within the last 24 hours, the Norwegian government have confirmed that they are now considering the utilisation of their sovereign wealth fund to assist Ukraine. That sovereign wealth fund is currently worth £1.4 trillion. And for those of us like myself who are unfamiliar with that particular denomination of currency, that is £1,380 billion. Now, that came from Norway investing from its vast oil and gas resource. And they didn't even put any money in for the first 5 years in 1990 or thereabouts. So, yes, we're happy to take intervention.
Tess White.
Tess White.
Thank you, Mr Ewing, for taking an intervention. I wonder if you could address 2 points. Firstly, the point about the Scottish Government selling the seabed off cheaply and not using the money to invest in new energies. And secondly, and it's something for the people in the gallery today who have come from the North East and they really want to hear this, your view on bringing people along with you and not taking away prime arable land and productive land in the process, and not destroying.
Thank you, Ms White. That's
and
quite
not destroying
go back to
their homeland.
We'll go back to Mr Ewing.
Thank you, Mr Ewing.
Those points.
Well, as far I think I'll leave the first point. I'm not sure that I would accept that, but I haven't made a specific study of that, to be candid. So it'd be wrong, therefore, to form a view. I know it's a bit of a novelty not to have a view when one is unacquainted with the facts, but I'm an old-fashioned kind of guy. So the second point I'll come on to, but I was going to say that, I do think that there is a necessary future for oil and gas in the UK and Scotland. It is dwindling, and the cessation of production which we're talking about in fields like Rosebank and Jackdaw are, frankly, de minimis in relation to global production. I mean, there's 100 million barrels of oil or gas equivalent per day in the world. We don't contribute much more than about 1% of that in the UK. So our reduction and elimination, as our Green colleagues would have, of all future developments, even although they've invested billions of pounds in these developments, incidentally, I mean, the taxpayer would have to pay all that money back, is completely futile, because we only produce 0.1% of the world's carbon emissions. If Scotland ceased to exist, it would not make the slightest difference to global warming, nor anything we do. We do need to have gas storage. In Britain, the storage capacity is 10 times less or thereabouts than Germany, Netherlands and France. And my friend Charles Henry, a former excellent energy minister in the UK, has been making that point for a long time. If communities are to come with us, Minister, and I've made this point before and I made it today, if communities are to come with us in this journey towards renewables, a journey that I kind of started off, I've not make myself popular with some of the audience here, but I think I have granted more consents than possibly any other minister in Europe in my time, so please feel free to boo. Sorry, you're not allowed to do that. But to be serious, the opposition is growing. And it's growing in the Highlands, it's growing in Aberdeenshire and the south of Scotland. And I think that the way to deal with it is for the UK and the Scottish governments to revive the scheme, which I was pleased to take forward with some good officials, where communities were provided with 10% or thereabouts of the capital costs of a share in a development by a fund called REEF. And I'm sorry, I just haven't got time. I'm very sorry to the Minister, but I've got 10 seconds. And that was assisted with 90% of the funding from a variety of banks. That can happen. It should happen. If it does happen, then not all, but some people will come with us as volunteers, not conscripts, on this journey.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. And I now call Emma Harper to be followed by Martin Whitfield. Ms Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start, as others have mentioned, development of nuclear power. I want to highlight the calls for increased spend for nuclear power, and we know that one plant alone, as others have mentioned, Hinkley Point C, is projected to cost £46 billion in construction costs alone. I am a bit dumbfounded as to how we can call nuclear clean and green when hazardous and toxic waste needs to be handled safely. There is a reason why nuclear decommissioning takes... Sure, I will. It's 30 seconds in, yeah.
Harper for giving way, and she highlights Hinkley Point and £47 billion cost. But quite close to Emma Harper's region is, of course, Sellafield. And in October of last year, The Guardian reported that the costs for cleaning up Sellafield have now reached £136 billion. Does Emma Harper think that that is a worthwhile cost? Is it worth paying to pay that amount for clean-up when we could have
Thank you, Ms Harper. I think we've got the gist. Ms Harper.
Thank Kevin Stewart for that intervention. I did visit Chapel Cross recently, and that was part of the conversation, was about the ongoing clean-up. There's a reason why nuclear decommissioning takes decades and requires many different highly skilled professionals to safely decommission sites like Chapel Cross on the other side of the Solway from Sellafield. The massive cost of new nuclear is no way to run an energy policy and no legacy to leave future generations, simply adding nuclear waste to the carbon waste that we're already bequeathing. We need renewables not only to reduce the pollution emitted now, but to minimise the impact of on our descendants who will live in our land decades and centuries from now. That's why I want to recognise Scotland's renewables revolution and remind Chamber of the huge role the South is playing in it. We have one of the biggest offshore wind farms in the country at Robin Rig in the Solway Firth. Although it is a source of continued annoyance that all the energy generated goes to the south side of the Solway and the marine support is carried out from Workington Port rather than Galloway. The Galloway Hydro Scheme is now over 90 years old. It was designed and built at a time when terms like renewables and net zero were not part of our daily lingo. The generating stations run by Drax along the route have a generating capacity of 110 megawatts, and that hydropower legacy continues to be shaped in the present day, marrying the old and the new, as just outside Kellerholm, the repurposing of former Glen Muckloch open cast coal mine into a major hydro-pump storage facility is underway right now. Presiding Officer, I want to thank the First Minister for visiting the carbon removers at Croft Head Farm near Crocketford in January this year and witnessing the technology being developed on carbon capture, storage and progressing. And I joined the Cabinet Secretary for a visit there too before the First Minister did. After the visit, Carbon Renewers announced a deal for carbon capture and storage in the North Sea, securing existing jobs and creating new high-quality, high-skilled roles in the technologies of the future. Not just in existing areas, but in Dumfriesshire also. That's exactly what Just Transition should be about. It's for all of us. I have visited on a number of occasions a local employer that contributes so well to Scotland's renewable industry, Natural Power, near Dalry in the Glenkens area. I was able to secure a British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly Economy Committee visit to Natural Power as part of our committee's inquiry into energy policy across the whole islands. Jeremy Sainsbury, who is the GB Policy Director, just give me a wee sec. Jeremy Sainsbury, who is the GB Policy Director at Natural Power, and his team made us so welcome and provided an excellent overview of some of the work of Natural Power in managing the energy generated by onshore turbines across the whole of the UK. And I will take an intervention from Mr Carson.
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate Emma Harper taking the intervention. Ministers are expected to observe the principles of public life known as the Nolan Principles, which include duty and respect. They outline ethical expectations for those in public life, reflecting the behaviours that publics expect of office bearers. Now, given the number of applications in Dumfries and Galloway that have been rejected by the public, rejected by the council and overturned by this government, including the KTR, which this government overruled an independent reporter, do you believe this government, her government, is working to the Nolan principles and respecting the rights of those who live in Galloway and rejecting the industrialisation of rural Galloway?
Ms Harper.
I thank Mr Carson for that intervention speech. We do need infrastructure to back up the new renewables. That needs to be balanced, though. And the Kendoon to Tongland pylon replacement project, I know there was a controversial decision that was made last week, but I do think that the people in Galloway do acknowledge the need for power. They just wanted it to be undergrounded where appropriate. So I have a lot of sympathies with what Finlay Carson intervened about, but I'm certainly clear that we do need to focus on what we can do to improve our renewable energy in south of Scotland, and not only in Dumfries and Galloway but across the borders as well. The South, like the country as a whole, is awash with renewables operating right now, as well as future potential. And however, I do think there is a however, presiding officer. It is scandalous that the price every household in my region pays for its electricity is so much higher than other parts of the UK. Standing charges for southern Scotland are 54% higher than every day than for customers in London. And even with changes coming soon, the cost will still be 22% higher for a constituent living literally right next door to our generating sites. I'm conscious of the time.
Yes, Ms Harper, you'll need to conclude.
Yep, I am conscious of the time. I just think one of the final things I'd like to see is if we had full control over energy in Scotland, pricing, distribution, everything, that's what we could achieve, and we could make things better for people if we had independence.
Thank you, Ms Harper. Thank you. I now call Martin Whitfield to be followed by Malcolm Marston. Mr Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer. I make reference to my register of interests with regard to community wind power. And I want to begin by thanking the SNP for finally bringing forward a debate on nuclear energy. It's taken a long time. Time and again it's been raised in this chamber, and we've argued for a serious discussion about Scotland's energy future and about how we're going to keep the lights on, industry running and bills down. And yet, despite the grandstanding we hear from the SNP and Green members on the energy policy, it's been a long time since they've actually given Parliament the chance to debate nuclear power in government time. So I welcome that. Better late than never. And as the motion sets out, and we've already heard, nuclear power is apparently clearly too dangerous, it's too expensive, and Scotland doesn't need it. This is the same SNP that told us we could run the country on wind and wishful thinking, and that importing gas from Norway was somehow better than using all of the tools at our disposal to secure our own energy future. It's the same SNP and Green Party that would rather see Scotland rely on imported nuclear energy from England and France than generate it ourselves. We've had contributions from Douglas Lumsden and Graham Simpson. I thank them both for referring to the strike price for tidal and stream, £172, for floating offshore, £139, but also, more importantly, that both those sources of energy can provide at the most 60%. Nuclear power can provide 90%, and that is important because that is about how you keep the lights on. And what's at stake here is jobs, investment and energy security. Torness Nuclear Power Station in the south of Scotland constituency of East Lothian has been the cornerstone of Scotland's energy supply for over 35 years. Clean, reliable electricity for millions of homes, generating over 1,200 megawatts of power. But more importantly, it's providing jobs. A strong union supported jobs with a good employer. Torness employs 700 people on a site, with nearly 2,000 further jobs supported through the supply chain. That's 700 families that rely on those wages, 700 workers whose expertise is keeping Scotland's lights on. Each worker has a gross value added of over £102,000. The average gross value added for workers in Scotland is just £53,000. Torness has contributed over £16 billion of economic value to the UK. And when we talk about nuclear power, We are talking about those real livelihoods, those real people, the real communities. Last December, EDF announced it would extend the lifespan of Torness to 2030, and that was the right decision because it protects jobs, because it keeps bills lower, it avoids shutting down a major source of clean energy. But what happens after 2030? Pleasure to give way to Mr Ewing.
I'm most grateful to Martin Whitfield for taking this intervention. Can he answer the question about the costs of decommissioning nuclear stations? Because although the work is welcome at Dounreay, I understand from the internet at least that it was announced last month that the clean-up operation will continue until the 2070s, 40 years later than the previous date, and the cost of the programme, previously £2.9 billion, now will mean a spend of £7.9 billion. Surely that must be taken into account when considering what forms of generation to invest in.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for that intervention because it also allows me to deal with the question of nuclear waste that has arisen in a number of contributions. I think to put it into some context, there are two parts, in essence, to the waste. There is the high-level, highly contaminated waste, which amounts to about 3%, which is approximately a dishwasher tablet for every single person in the UK. We could talk about the 15 million radioactive material packages that are transported annually worldwide, where there has never been one incident causing harm. And that's thanks to the robust packaging and strict safety standards that this industry adheres to at every level, and to the cost of the nuclear waste management. Nuclear power is, of course, the only power generation where the cost at the end of production is already factored into the results. And the cost of nuclear waste management is both very well understood and accounts for about 10% of the total costs of generating nuclear power, which ensures its economic feasibility. With regard even to wind turbines, there is no provision within their strike price for what we do at the end of their life after 20 or 30 years. I am conscious of time, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I would have liked the opportunity to have talked about small modular reactors, which have been raised a number of times today, and in which actually there is a huge potential to benefit Scotland. We require a mix of our energy production if we are going to make sure that the bills are kept low, that we have security looking at what happens in the world. And if nuclear power is not part of that solution, then this SNP government will owe a great debt with regard to the future when the lights do go out.
Great.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. And I call Michael Matheson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think from the course of debate so far, there are obviously points of division around whether nuclear should be part of our future energy mix, but there is clearly points of agreement, particularly around the value of renewables to our economy and the desire to make sure that we maximise that economic benefit for Scotland as a whole. We saw just last week in the report published by the Climate Intelligence report, which highlights the increasing value that the renewable energy sector has to Scotland, which is increasing year on year. And of course, the renewable energy sector is critical to us in supporting in the delivery of a just transition as we decarbonise our energy system. But of course, that just transition is dependent upon us being able to deliver not just the projects that are renewable in themselves, but also the technology that goes alongside these projects, the turbines, the nacelles, the blades, the towers, all of which go into that particular mix, which we need to start manufacturing here in Scotland if we are to deliver a just transition. But of course, in order for these projects to become a reality, to get to the point when a financial investment decision can be made, they require assurance around being able to connect to the national grid. And while we have saw over the course of the last decade plus investment in renewable projects, what we have not saw is a level of investment which has been needed within our grid infrastructure in order to meet that ever-increasing demand. And the decisions that were made by the last Conservative government to increase our dependency on renewables, offshore renewables in particular, has resulted in a need to significantly increase our capacity in our grid infrastructure. So although we all want to see renewables being successful, we want to see it as a growing part of our economy, the reality is, in order to achieve that, we also need to see grid investment taking place. But I recognise the concerns and issues that communities have around some of this investment and these projects as they move forward, and it's important that we ensure that our DNOs are being held to account and pressed in order to make sure that they are minimising the potential impact that they will have on communities where that can reasonably be made. I'll give way to Rachel Hamilton.
Rachel Hamilton. Matheson. I think some of the solution to the mega pylons that are going through, for example, the borders and are greatly unpopular by lots and lots of communities, would be to look at the MPF4 that would give communities a greater say. Does he agree with that?
Look, I think we should always try to make sure that we use the system as best we can. I think using terms like mega pylons don't help the reality of what we are trying to deal with, and that is to make sure that we have the right grid infrastructure in place. For example, in my own constituency, the new pylon networks are being introduced. I met with Spen recently to discuss that. Then, of course, there will be concerns around these issues, but we are having to decarbonise our energy system as a result of decisions made by her own previous government that will have to be delivered, and we have to try to make sure that we address these issues as well. Can I turn briefly to the issue of SMRs? And I do recognise and respect those who are pro a greater use of nuclear power within our energy mix, that are in favour of SMRs as well. But we also need to be cautious and recognise that SMRs are an unproven technology. They have not even completed the generic design assessment process as yet within the UK. There are no SMRs operating commercially in the world at this particular point as well. And we also have to recognise that it will take some time for them even to be delivered once they get regulatory approval. In my view, I think this side of the next 15 years, it is highly unlikely they will play a significant part within our future energy mix. But on that point, I want to turn to a technology that has served us well for many, many decades, and that is pumped storage hydro. You know, the late Tom Johnston, when he was Secretary of State for Scotland, when he created the North of Scotland Hydro Board, did so for two purposes. One, to bring electricity to the Highlands, and two, for the betterment of the Highlands. Well, thankfully, the Highlands do actually have electricity these days. And unfortunately, when I was Energy Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, when he was Energy Secretary in England, couldn't be persuaded by my argument that we should put a cap and floor in place to have a new age of pumped storage here in Scotland. His argument was, it's very much a Scottish issue, not one which the UK Government were interested in at that particular point. But we are at the point of a new age of pumped storage in Scotland. I had the opportunity to chair an event for the British Hydropower Association last week in Parliament, where there is a real enthusiasm with the new cap and floor being brought in by Ofgem for long-duration energy storage to unlock what could be 9 mega projects in Scotland, which would deliver over 5 gigawatts of additional capacity, over 200 gigawatt hours of energy, which would be produced from these new hydro projects, all of which would play a hugely important part in making sure that we have the mix that we require within our energy system, but at the same time also benefiting from the economic benefits that come from these projects. And I hope that as we go forward, we not only start to focus on some of the new technology, but recognise some of the long-standing, reliable technologies like pumped storage hydro can play a large part in Scotland's future energy mix in the years ahead.
Thank you, Mr Masterson. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Patrick Harvey to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Well, we have, I think, heard some well-reasoned and thoughtful and well-informed speeches, and we've heard some bluster as well. I think, in particular, some of the SMR boosterism that we've heard has been a little bit overblown, a little bit silly. people making speeches about how SMRs are just lovely, SMRs are modern, SMRs are just wonderful and they'll solve every problem. And I was pleased that Michael Matheson tried to burst that bubble at one point. At one point, I actually almost thought I was hearing Sir Humphrey Appleby telling his minister, SMRs are quite simply the nuclear power station Harrods would sell you. And I think we should take some of the speeches we heard on that with the same kind of absurdity of those performances. SMRs have not been proven anywhere in the world. And in fact, I draw members' attention to the comments of the UK Environment Audit Committee at the UK Parliament, which wrote just last year to the outgoing UK government, expressing doubts on SMRs. It seems unlikely, I'm quoting now, it seems unlikely that the reactor, referring to whichever reactor wins the UK design competition, it seems unlikely the reactor will be contributing generating capacity to the grid until 2035, which is the date by when the government expects the UK electricity grid to have been decarbonised. And that's the last UK government. The new UK government wants to decarbonise the grid by 2030. SMRs will play no role in doing that, even if somewhere around the world somebody cracks the many challenges in making them viable. I wanted to talk a little bit about the links to our previous discussion on the geopolitical changes that we're seeing around the world, because there is a profound link to energy policy. And there's a good reason why many of my colleagues in the European Green Party have used slogans like more wind, less war. Less power from gas, less power for Putin. The way that we move away from fossil fuels, which have been used as a geopolitical weapon by global bullies for decades, even for generations, that needs to be accelerated. And there are people who would say that nuclear power can be part of that shift away from fossil fuels. But nuclear power is still based and would still bake in the reliance on a fixed, finite commodity, high-grade uranium ore. And whoever ends up possessing that commodity, if the world was to commit to a transition away from fossil fuels, which was fundamentally based on nuclear, we would simply be redesigning that same dynamic, but with a different commodity, not fossil fuels, but high-grade uranium ore, and future generations would come to curse our name for having made that mistake. Various members have talked about fairness in this transition. I talked in particular about fairness in terms of cost and contrasted the low cost of production of clean, green, renewable electricity with the high cost of consumption. That is a fundamental injustice, and it needs to be changed. I wish to goodness that we could change that here in Scotland, but the UK government, in its review of pricing, must be under pressure to break that link between fossil fuel prices and electricity prices to give a real incentive for people to shift away from fossil fuels for their heat and their transport. Some people... yes, indeed.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank the member for giving way. You'll be familiar with the Queen's Quay District Heat Network, as I am, and the reason why the scaling of that technology, Glasgow-built technology, has been undermined is because of the addiction to gas pricing, how that's driving the electricity costs that then, in turn, make it uncompetitive relative to gas for heating.
Patrick Harvey.
Yes, indeed, and up to very recently, a complete lack of consumer protection in heat networks as well. That needs to be fixed. But we are and have been and need to continue to learn the lessons from countries like Denmark on how to do heat networks well. Some people have posited the issue of fairness purely in terms of the favourability of particular types of energy infrastructure. Do people want a pylon built? Do people want this infrastructure, that infrastructure, wind turbines or whatever? I would make the case that all energy infrastructure brings controversy with it. When I was first elected, Scotland was still burning coal to generate electricity. And communities not so far away from where I lived were blighted with open-cast coal extraction and businesses with an abysmal track record in protecting communities from an environmental harm, seeking constantly to expand that open-cast coal extraction. Every solution, every choice that we might make in terms of what kind of energy system should we build will bring controversy with it in terms of some of the infrastructure. But I'm looking at the moment on recent polling by YouGov on public support for the UK getting more energy from different types of energy sources. And the overwhelming support is for tidal, solar, offshore wind, hydroelectric, geothermal, onshore wind and fairly strong support for biofuels. The public view was fairly mixed, fairly balanced on nuclear, and the public view on fossil fuel was strongly opposed. So I do think that we need to recognise that aspect. There isn't going to be time to address everything that I would like to have said, but notwithstanding some of the anti-net zero comments that we've heard today, Presiding Officer, which would have been more at home at the conference of the Heartland Institute or the Reform Party, perhaps one or two members have decided to jump ship early. There is a question around just transition, because just transition needs to be more than a phrase, and it will not be if we leave the political and economic power with the corporates, with the billionaires, with the shareholders, investors who will only ever serve their own short-term interests. Governments need to make a just transition happen. That hasn't been happening so far. And whether it's Grangemouth, whether it's the North Sea Industries, whether it's oil and gas companies slashing their already meagre renewable investment, or whether it's every household in the country worried about their energy bills and wanting to shift away from fossil fuels affordably, the market won't deliver. Government must.
Thank you. I now call on Michael Mara.
Officer, I'm glad to add my voice to those welcoming that the Scottish Government is engaging on the nuclear agenda and following the announcements of the Scottish Labour Party conference quite so closely. So Anas Sarwar has thrown down the gauntlet to this Government to deal in reality and to seize the energy and industrial opportunity that is in front of us as a country. But so far, unfortunately, the SNP is doubling down on what is a long-standing opposition to nuclear energy. It strikes me in the discussion that we've heard so far today that case is somewhat retrofitted in opposition to the current reality. What began many decades ago with the perceived relationship to nuclear military power and the role of the British state that they contest has morphed as that link became less credible. And can we draw the contrast, I think, to the scion of environmentalism, James Lovelock, or the campaigning journalist, George Monbiot? When the facts changed, they changed their minds. And the facts that changed were the gathering evidence of the urgency of climate change. That's why they converted to believing that nuclear power was the right thing to do. Patrick Harvey, I think, set out a picture in his first speech of a distributed system with reduced demand that, unfortunately, may be a laudable aspiration, but bears no reality to the situation that is in front of us at the moment, at the time. It's a government, what we have instead is a government with no energy strategy and no plan to deliver an effective transition. And it also doesn't deal at all with the predicted vast increase in electricity demand across the UK and in Scotland. So all the facts tell us that a sustainable energy mix must be delivered, and too often ministers of this government have been caught out using statistics claiming effective energy independence, and have had to correct the record after the event, given the very welcome growth in renewable sources. But the reality is an interconnected UK and European energy market that relies on consumption markets, bill subsidies and government price guarantees on a huge scale. But it also relies on baseload that is predictable and reality. We've heard a lot about baseload today. And that is right at the heart of our baseload in Scotland, is nuclear energy as a key part of our energy mix. The SNP government have been very happy, time and again, to extend the lifespan of existing nuclear power over their 18 years in government. So if the same sites are used, if safety standards are maintained that they must be satisfied with if they are to continue them, and if the technology continues to improve, then why turn our faces against an energy that is so integral to the mix? Because we also turn our back, if I can continue at the moment, and we also turn our back against the jobs and the wages from domestic generation here in Scotland. I'm thinking of John McGlinchey from Dundee, who goes to Tannadice on Saturday, the Hawkhill Tavern on Sunday, and the train on Monday to go to England to work as a highly skilled welder on nuclear power stations. Times that by thousands. Wages lost, economic activity lost to Scotland, while we are all set to import nuclear energy for years, for decades to come, as Paul Sweeney so ably set out. And I thought that Martin Whitfield paid great tribute to the workers in East Lothian and Torness, who have made such a substantial contribution to our economy. And frankly, when the question is asked, where would these nuclear power stations be, I know that Torness is keen to have one. So nobody sensible, in contrast to this, nobody sensible is dismissing the renewable future potential. Which brings me to Douglas Lumsden and the Conservatives' increasing rejection of reality. So the plans he now vocally opposes were laid out by the Conservative government, as Michael Matheson set out in a very fine speech, not at the moment, he set out in a very fine speech. What Mr Matheson, though, neglected to say was that was done in partnership with the SNP government. And those plans are the cornerstone of what stands for an industrial policy from the SNP government. So they need the political bravery on both sides to actually whether to defend the record that they had or to defend the projects as they stand at the moment. Please.
Cabinet Secretary.
Would you also not recognise that the Conservatives that we have in this chamber here have an objection to they have had a historic objection to mandating community benefits and the very types of consultation that the new UK government and the Scottish government are now doing to improve the system. They denied that. They didn't want that.
Michael Mara.
It's a very fair point, but I do think I would reiterate again that I think it is incumbent on the Minister's government as well to stand behind these projects more fully, because they are controversial in terms of the infrastructure projects that have been set out. Mr Matheson talked very clearly to that. And that case for infrastructure, I have to say, will only be won through economic benefit. So it's been pointed out, money for scout huts, is not sufficient. It has to be jobs for the next generation. No, thank you, sir. The failure to grow the supply chain in Scotland results, frankly, from planning delays. Berwick Bank, as pointed out by Sarah Boyack, 2 years on ministers' desks. A Scotland, no, thank you, sir. If I can continue.
Mr. Kerr.
A Scotland auction generated the fees in 2022. They were in the budget in 22-23, and 23-24 as well. They were raided then to plug the gaps in an incompetent emergency budget. The following year, they were used as a second reserve. Nothing was ever done to invest the money in employment. And this very morning, the Finance Minister was unable to tell the Finance Committee what the projected £350 million of funds for this year will actually be spent on. Very far from shovel-ready. So for the first time in 14 years, we have a UK government that is facing up to the climate crisis and taking meaningful action to address it. Clean power by 2030, the creation of GB Energy and consenting reforms to speed up renewables projects. Last month, the Prime Minister announced plans for historic expansion in nuclear power, enabling small modular reactors to be built in sites across England and Wales. With UK electricity consumption set to double by 2040, the UK Labour government is facing up to that reality and planning for the future. Ed Miliband has written to Anas Sarwar in recent days saying that in the event that Scotland changed its policy on new nuclear power, we, the UK government, would seek to work with the Scottish government to make new nuclear happen with all the benefits for low carbon generation and jobs it could provide. That's the opportunity that could be seized. That's the new direction that Scotland needs.
Thank you, and I call on Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to welcome the opportunity to debate renewables. I'm going to focus my remarks today on how we deliver our low-carbon future, what it means for households and the effect it will have on their bills. But let me start with a broader point about nuclear energy. I do find the nuclear section of the motion slightly bizarre and lacking an evidence-based approach. Sarah Boyack described it as negative and a retrograde motion. Sarah Boyack also made the case for a robust mix of low-carbon energy that serves us well in all conditions, and I would associate myself with those remarks. Let's be clear, nuclear is a low-carbon energy source. According to the United Nations, nuclear has the lowest carbon footprint of any energy source when you factor in construction and decommissioning. By all means, let's ensure wind, solar, hydro and other renewables are the driving force in the energy transition. And I echo Gillian Martin's comments regarding Scotland's potential in this area. I would also like to point out to you, Presiding Officer, that it is indeed fake news to say that myself or the Scottish Conservatives are against community benefit. In fact, in 2017, I announced a policy to expand community benefit. Very happy.
Cabinet Secretary.
Possible I didn't make myself entirely clear. I'm not saying that they were against community benefits. What I was saying is that I had asked the previous government to explore mandating both community benefits and community engagement, and I was told no.
Maurice Golden.
Well, I haven't been in government, and I'm not responsible to or accountable for anyone who has been in government, and therefore there is no point saying somebody else over there said something when the member referenced people in this chamber. We can only be responsible for what we say and what we do, and it's fake news to suggest otherwise. Patrick Harvey, I would like to agree with some points that the member made. He says we waste too much energy and that energy efficiency must be improved in our buildings. I agree with that. And with Alex Cole-Hamilton, he made the point that Scotland should be leading the world in clean energy, and he saw a vision of Scotland as a renewable powerhouse. And I would like to associate myself with those remarks. We also need energy sources capable of generating 24/7 to maintain grid stability and avoid brown or black starts. We've already seen the huge spikes in energy bills a reliance on foreign gas imports can have, not to mention the implications for energy security. And building over capacity brings with it extra balancing, storage and transmission costs. All measures that again risk increasing the price people pay for their energy. Happy to give way.
Most grateful to Mr Golden. Given that I think it's accepted by the Conservatives that even if the new SMRs are capable of being worked, and many members argue that's not the case, it would take 7 years, according to Mr Kerr, to build them, and it takes perhaps 3 years to build a gas power station, and 85% of the 30 million homes in Britain are fuelled by gas. Should we not go for gas rather than nuclear? Would that not provide the backup and baseload which is required?
Maurice Golden.
Well, I think the member makes a valid point. But in the long term, we have to transition away from carbon-based fuels, and that means gas. On transmission infrastructure, Douglas Lumsden has highlighted the case made by communities asking to be listened to by the Scottish Government. And as well as the Nolan Principles, this is also a requirement under the Aarhus Convention of 1998. But as Graham Simpson pointed out, and I quote, there can be no transition without transmission. So therefore, there's a balance that requires to be struck in all of this. Now, we know the SNP have a long-standing policy of arguing for Scottish households to pay more for their energy bills. For example, they have called for standing charges to be scrapped. Those charges help to pay for network costs. So if you scrap them, then you almost certainly look at higher unit costs to make up the shortfall. In other words, those who use the most energy would pay more, such as households in rural areas like the north of Scotland, or those relying on medical equipment, although second homeowners would benefit significantly. Then take the SNP position for a floor approach to the forward-looking charge of transmission demand residual, which will, according to Ofgem, increase current charges, particularly for those customers in the north of Scotland. And while many members today have mentioned the current transmission charging regime to NUOS, one thing that everyone should note is that while Scottish generators pay more, Scottish consumers pay less. And if anyone is arguing for generators to pay less, the quid pro quo is that consumers here in Scotland will pay more. Now, I do have concerns about Ofgem's decision to back zonal pricing model. Splitting the country up into different pricing zones risks, well, theoretically sound, investment by creating unstable market conditions. What we have to be doing is to create a friendly environment for business, innovation and investment, and that is something this government struggles to cope with, whether it be around anaerobic digestion, whether it be around heat pump installations, which unfortunately I don't have enough time to go into. But more work needs to be looked. So if we're going to make progress on this...
The member is concluding.
If we're going to make progress on this and a just transition as a whole, the SNP need to step up. And speaking from myself and my colleagues in this chamber, I can assure the Scottish Government we will be there to support them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Golden. And I call on the Minister to wind up to 8 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to begin by thanking members for their, in many cases, very insightful contributions to this important debate today. There was a notable shyness among the advocates of nuclear power about volunteering communities in their own constituencies, which would host not only, the member will let me finish, not only nuclear power stations, but also they were even more shy, even shyer, I should say, about the issue of hosting nuclear waste repositories. Anyway, I mention that because the debate is timely and because it has given us the opportunity to talk about the significant changes in global and UK energy markets, as well as UK-wide policy developments and court decisions that have had a direct impact on Scotland's energy sector. All of that brings a renewed focus to the importance of renewable energy generation. As many members mentioned today, our progress towards net zero and Scotland's future energy sector. Now, I won't be able to do justice to the many members who made contributions, but there were in fact at least some points of consensus today. For instance, Alec Cole-Hamilton pointed out the need to speed up the pace of grid connections that would obviate constraint payments and allow renewables to flourish. Audrey Nicholl mentioned the need to get transmission charge reform in a place that was... I will give way, yes.
Douglas Lumsden.
For taking an intervention. Can you tell us if the Scottish Government have a view on zonal pricing, whether they actually approve, but they would be in favour of that or not?
Minister.
As the member alludes to, the zonal pricing has to be done in a way that's right and a way that's fair. But the interesting thing about some of the contributions we just had towards the end of this debate is they acknowledge the unfair nature of the status quo when it comes to transmission charges and many other related issues. But that is a conversation that we are having with the UK Government. Paul Sweeney raised a question, if I heard him rightly, about small modular reactors at Grangemouth. Forgive me if I didn't hear that right, but I should be clear that I understand that INEOS confirmed in 2022 that these did not form part of their net zero roadmap for Grangemouth. Presiding Officer, I can't, as I say, refer to everyone who spoke today, but as the Cabinet Secretary made clear, the Scottish Government does unapologetically reject new nuclear plants in Scotland because of the risks and costs that their development... I'm not anti-science, no, but I'll give way to someone sensible.
Paul Sweeney.
I thank the Minister for giving way, but is the point that he's just made precisely why INEOS decided not to invest in SMR development at Grangemouth, similarly why Rolls-Royce ruled out Scotland as a location for the heavy pressure vessel manufacturing facility that it had planned for SMRs?
Minister.
My understanding is that Rolls-Royce, perhaps for reasons that are, the member knows more about than I do, but my understanding is that Rolls-Royce similarly ruled out similar developments there at Grangemouth. I want to say something. I want to say something about the fact that has been alluded to a number of times about the carbon neutrality or otherwise of nuclear generation. So I accept nuclear generation per se may not be, it is not a carbon-intensive process, but the toxic and life-threatening waste that it creates, I heard it alluded to rather charmingly at one point in the debate being compared to tablets for dishwashers, but it's a little more toxic than that. The toxic and life-threatening waste that it creates requires complex and robust management. No, thank you. to ensure the protection of both people and the environment. This, coupled with the enduring risk of nuclear accidents, which recent history shows us, means that we cannot simply ignore the dangers of producing and managing hazardous radioactive waste products. The Scottish Government also remains unconvinced of the economic argument for new nuclear. In 2015, the International Energy Agency published research that suggested that new nuclear power in the UK would be more expensive than in any other country, and yet the UK Government has continued to commit huge sums of public money to nuclear energy. As we've heard, Hinkley Point C is over budget by £28 billion when accounting for inflation, and running at least 6 years late. Now, just to put that in some kind of perspective, £28 billion is equivalent to Scotland's entire health budget for the year, and then half as much as that again. Despite these delays and cost overruns, the UK Government and its allies in quarters of this chamber continue to stake taxpayer money on this nuclear gamble. And to be absolutely clear, it is the view of the Scottish Government that the UK Government should instead focus on increasing the deployment of renewables. The Cabinet Secretary at the beginning of this debate set out... I will give way, yes.
Finlay Carson.
Appreciate the Minister giving way. Now, you say your focus, the Minister says his focus is on renewables, but we've got no idea how much renewables rural Scotland is supposed to take. We've got an overcapacity already in Galloway of wind turbines, yet there's no clear indication when that's going to stop. We've got a local authority that's inundated with applications for wind farms, for upgraded power lines, for BESS, for solar. And the government are overturning the views of the local people and the views of the independent reporters. So will you agree to a moratorium in Dumfries and Galloway until this government gets its act together and actually tell us what its plans for renewable energy is?
Always through the chair, please, Mr Carson. Minister.
Where I can agree with the member, and I can't agree with the member on a lot of what he's just said, but where I can agree with the member is on the importance of making sure that we bring communities with us, and on the issue of targets around the growth of renewables in Scotland and the role that a range of technologies are playing in our journey to net zero. In 2023, renewable energy generation was the equivalent to powering all households in Scotland for around 5.5 years. Under this government, 70% of electricity generated in Scotland in 2023 was from renewable sources, a marked increase compared to 32% in 2013. I must make progress. Time is running out, I'm afraid. These figures illustrate that our policy position of no to nuclear and yes to renewables is bearing fruit and delivering clean energy for Scotland. The findings, Presiding Officer, of the Fraser of Allender Institute report, published in December 2023, show a thriving renewable energy sector in Scotland that generated in excess of £10 billion of output in 2021 and supports more than 42,000 jobs. Further independent analysis from Ernst & Young shows that low-carbon and renewable energy could support nearly 80,000 jobs in Scotland by 2050. These reports highlight that we are seizing the economic opportunities of the energy transition. And as I mentioned to Finlay Carson, we do need to bring people with us, and we are alive to that issue. That was a point that was made also by Emma Harper and by Fergus Ewing in different ways at different points of this debate. But as we've heard, in the last 12 months, more than £30 million of benefits have been offered to Scottish communities, and we will continue to work with the renewables sector and with the UK Government to ensure that communities feel the maximum benefit from the transition. We know... the Minister must conclude. We know what Scotland needs to deliver cleaner, greener energy, and it is not new nuclear. The deployment of renewables provides Scotland with the best pathway to net zero by 2045, creating a climate-friendly energy system that delivers affordable, resilient and clean energy supplies for communities, businesses and consumers.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on Scotland's renewable future. Point of order, Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, President. And it's on a point of order. Today, in today's debate, the Minister said once again that Scottish ministers couldn't meet with campaign groups because that would be a breach of the Ministerial Code. According to Chapter 5 of the Ministerial Code, it lays out that they can meet but not pass comment or issue their personal view. And also, if they're meeting one side, they should actually be meeting both sides. Can I check with you, Presiding Officer, that there has been any approach to change the official record to show that ministers can actually meet campaign groups?
I would say, Mr Lumsden, that the ministerial code is not a matter for me and therefore not a matter from which I'll be ruling, on which I'll be ruling from the Chair. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 16685 on approval of an SSI, and I ask Jamie Hepburn, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister, and I call on Tim Eagle, up to 3 minutes.
And can I remind members of my register of interest as a farmer? Tonight, Presiding Officer, we're being asked to support an SSI on the new whole farm plan, a new condition farmers and crofters across the country will have to comply with in order to receive basic agricultural support. This year, those applying for support will need to complete 2 of 5 new plans: an animal health and welfare plan, a biodiversity audit, an integrated pest management plan, a carbon audit or soil analysis. My colleagues and I will vote to support this SSI today. However, to suggest we fully support this is far from accurate. What we don't want to do is hold up vital payments to farmers. But I want to be open with the Minister and say we walk very, very tepidly with you. If the Minister read the room right during the committee session on this topic, he will know that across this Parliament there are real concerns about the process of agricultural policy change. I have 2 key fears, Presiding Officer. The first is that the Rural Support Plan, a key document that sets the overall vision and strategy for agricultural support, is not due to be placed before this Parliament until after a series of secondary legislation implementing various new policies. I am aware that stakeholders outside this Parliament are deeply worried about this. Equally, there is concern that the SSI before us today, along with the previous SSI on the Scottish Suckler Beef Support Scheme and future secondary legislation, are not fairly treating smaller farmers and crofters who are unfairly disadvantaged by the changes. The industry wanted to see less bureaucracy, not more, and I remain concerned that these plans will not only be detrimental to some parts of our industry, but won't actually achieve any outcomes. Now, I realise this government seems to like doing it, but without key information, we are putting through secondary legislation in a vacuum. It undermines this Parliament's ability to provide fair scrutiny, and it risks damage to our incredible agricultural community. Presiding Officer, our farmers and crofters produce great quality food and drink. We lead the world on animal health and welfare. The industry is desperately trying to seek new methods to increase biodiversity and reduce climate impacts and make sure all of us have wholesome food on our tables. Yes, there is more to do, but government must work with and for the industry. That includes recognising the worrying reduction in livestock numbers and helping to support production so that the whole supply chain, which brings with it thousands of jobs in Scotland, can prosper. As always, the Scottish Conservatives give our full and unwavering support to our agriculture community, on farm and in the wider supply chain. But unless more answers are given in respect to future agricultural policy, we may not be so willing next time to vote with the Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Eagle. I call on the Minister to respond. Up to 3 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, these regulations move to introduce the foundations of the whole farm plan approach as a condition of the basic payment scheme. Now, let's be clear, this is about ensuring that our farmers and crofters have the information that they need to be more productive and more profitable. This approach will baseline their current practices, allowing them to progress and to measure their progress. Now, we had an extremely interesting meeting today with John Gillian, who states that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So what we're doing will highlight the practices, will highlight the good practices that are already being undertaken to help them to identify where they could become more efficient, cut emissions, increase biodiversity, while continuing to produce the high-quality food that we all want them to do. In 2025, we're asking that 2 of the following plans and audits are undertaken: the Animal Health and Welfare Plan, a Nature Report, a Carbon Report, an Integrated Pest Management Plan and a Soil Report. Now, businesses are free to select which 2 they undertake based upon their own situation, and 2 of these requirements already have equivalence. For instance, the Animal Welfare Plan from QMS, which is one of the questions that we've been asked regularly. So let me be clear, the whole farm plan approach was developed with the industry, and we have worked with farmers, crofters, agricultural stakeholders
skills delivery partners and our environmental partners in developing this new conditionality. And I note the recent response from the Scottish Crofting Federation, but let me be clear. Culturally, economically and socially, crofting is a vital part of our rural economy. And that is why my officials and I have worked and continue to work with the crofting community to ensure that these proposals meet their need, which is why I've instructed my officials to write to the Chief Executive of the Scottish Crofters Federation to come and meet me to discuss the best way forward. Now, these regulations have been drafted to come into force on the 5th of March 2025 so that farmers and crofters can set out in their single application form which two plans they have this year. The SAF opens on the 15th of March and is expected to close on the 15th of May. Yes, I'll give way to
Finlay Carson.
I appreciate the Minister give way. Given that we're looking at the SSI today, would you agree that the code design of these policies is not working? Because at this late stage we're still getting real concerns from our crofters and our smaller farmers.
Minister. As I said to Mr Finlay in the committee, no, I didn't agree with that principle because we have co-designed it with the crofting community, with the farming community, and they were part of the steering group which actually delivered this SSI that we're trying to do today. So this marks a significant point in our progress towards becoming a world leader in sustainable and regenerative agriculture, and it is right that we must expect more from those in receipt of public funds and the support of this journey. Failures to bring these regulations into force would risk undermining that progress and the efforts and the work of many of our farmers and crofters who are already undertaking the improvements that we're asking for. So I want to finish by reassuring members that we are committed to continuing to support our farmers and crofters to ensure that they can continue to deliver for sustainable food production, nature and climate, and also to ensure our thriving rural communities.
Thank you, Minister. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, and there are 5 questions to be put as a result of today's business. And can I remind members that if the amendment in the name of Douglas Lumsden is agreed to, the amendment in the name of Sarah Boyack will fall. And the first question is that Amendment 16657.3 in the name of Douglas Lumsden, which seeks to amend Motion 16657 in the name of Gillian Martin on Scotland's renewable future, be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. There will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system. I remind members that if the amendment in the name of Douglas Lumsden is agreed to, the amendment in the name of Sarah Boyack will fall, and the question is that Amendment 16657.3 in the name of Douglas Lumsden, which seeks to amend Motion 16657 in the name of Gillian Martin on Scotland's renewable future, be agreed, and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 16657.3 in the name of Douglas Lumsden is yes 29, no 89. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the next question is that amendment 16657.2 in the name of Sarah Boyack, which seeks to amend motion 16657 in the name of Gillian Martin on Scotland's renewable future, be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote, and members should cast their vote now. The vote is closed. I call Michael Matheson for a point of order.
Presiding Officer, my app wouldn't connect. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Matheson. We'll ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 16657.2 in the name of Sarah Boyack is yes 46, no 72. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 16657.1 in the name of Patrick Harvey, which seeks to amend motion 16657 in the name of Gillian Martin on Scotland's renewable future, be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 16657.1 in the name of Patrick Harvey is yes 11, no 33. There were 75 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the next question is that motion 16657 in the name of Gillian Martin on Scotland's renewable future be agreed. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call Gordon MacDonald for a point of order.
Presiding officer.
Just excuse me one moment, Mr MacDonald.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get a microphone on for you.
No.
Can I ask Mr MacDonald if you just use another microphone? Thank you.
Thanks, George. My app wouldn't connect. I would have voted yes.
Thank you. We'll ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on motion 16657 in the name of Gillian Martin is yes 69, no 50. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And the final question is that motion 16685 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on approval of an SSI be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed, and that concludes decision time, and we'll now move on to members' business in the name of Carol Mockin.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healy.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel, or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.